Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Everqueen in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 11. The emperor gazed out on the city surrounding the Baiheng hive, his hands clasped behind his back. He considered the heart of his fledgling empire. By the standards of humanity in this day and age, the view was magnificent, even with the sunlight limited by the dust and ashes that still polluted the atmosphere. The Himalayas still stood tall and proud despite the horrors that Terra had been through, a testament to the enduring power of nature. The Baiheng hive, and the bustling golden city that extended from it were in turn a testament to the determination and enduring nature of mankind. And yet, all the emperor could see was all that had been lost. Despite it being early afternoon, there was less sunlight today than there would have been in the late evening of Terra during the 21st millennium. The snow on the Himalayas was not pure white, but a sickly gray and pink, polluted by toxins and chemicals. The sky was darkened by clouds of ash and dust, rather than a soft blue. The air was as thick and polluted as the cities that had suffered the worst from humanity's first industrial revolution towards the end of second millennium, and that was despite the devices the emperor and his engineers had crafted to clear the air and reduce pollution. But if things went according to plan, all that would change soon. Lowering his gaze, the emperor down on the Thunder Warriors training in one of the distant fields below. For a normal human, the enhanced soldiers were too far away to be anything more than specks in the distance, but the emperor's enhanced senses allowed him to observe them as easily as he was standing next to them, even from a distance of several hundred meters. And what he saw pleased him. The Thunder Warriors moved with a calm discipline and cohesion that would have been alien to them only a few short years ago as their custodian trainers guided them through their drills. The emperor had never hoped to see such improvements in the Thunder Warriors, crude and barbaric as their enhancements had been. But they had improved all the same, and their efficiency had increased by leaps and bounds. They were true soldiers now, not just rampaging berserkers, and in turn, the unification of Terra was going far more smoothly than it had before. The 10th Legion was only the latest of the Legio Cati Aegis to be retrained as such, and they would be ready for deployment soon. Only 4 more legions had to be stabilized and retrained, the 2nd, the 6th, the 17th and the 20th. And it was all thanks to his unique guest. Isha was a conundrum, even to him, the emperor acknowledged. He had initially allowed her to live solely because he had wished to learn how a god construct, even faded and diminished as she was, had materialized upon Terra with less effort and damage to the barrier between the immaterium and materium than the weakest and most pathetic daemons. Then, her offer of aid had intrigued him enough to allow her to live longer, if only to see what scraps of knowledge he could extract from her. And now, he trusted her with his soldiers, to provide important resources for the Imperium, to heal Terra itself. Such a thing would have been unthinkable just a few short years ago, and yet. Part of the emperor still resented having to rely on a Zeno, and especially a Zeno god construct, but he would have been a fool to not utilize Isha's knowledge and aid to the utmost limit. The benefits to both the Imperium's civilians and military had been beyond number, allowing him to both improve the quality of life for the people under his rule and increase the rate of his conquests. And then there was the potential for what she could for Terra as a whole. There were few things the emperor held dearer to his heart than the desire to see humanity's home world bloom once more. With Isha's aid, that could be done in a mere century rather than thousands of years, and far more efficiently than it would have been otherwise. Nevertheless, it still rankled to have to rely on Isha, to not be able to heal this world himself. Less than 10,000 years ago, he had possessed access to technology that could have restored Terra without needing to rely on an Eldar goddess. Not that Terra would have even needed to be restored at the time. If only the Eldar had not sunken into their crazed debauchery. The emperor sighed, dismissing the thought with a sigh. There was no point in dwelling on what might have happened. Isha was here and willing to help now, and refusing her aid simply because she was Eldar would have been both petty and selfish, a dereliction of his duties as humanity's guardian. And it was not solely the fault of the Eldar that humanity had fallen so far, the emperor admitted to himself. He would never hold the sins of his people to be in any way equal to that of the Eldar, but it would be a lie to claim that mankind's flaws had played no role in their own downfall. Humanity could have weathered the age of strife far better if not for the Iron War and the events that led up to it. Some of the greatest obstacles to humanity's ascension would come from within, not without, and the master of mankind could not allow himself to forget that, not now and not ever. A penny for your thoughts, Revelation. Malkador. The Emperor turned to look at the Sigillite, having sensed his approach some time ago, giving his old friend a faint smile. Are you truly using archaism from the third millennium? And in any case, I dare say my thoughts are worth far more than 1 penny. Malkador chuckled as he stopped leaning on his staff and straightened to his full height, dropping the pretense of being a frail old man in the Emperor's private chambers. That is what you claim, but I have seen little evidence to prove it. The Sigillite fired back with a light-hearted jab. Yes, well, I am not convinced that you are the authority on the subject. In fact, I dare say my opinion far outweighs yours in this matter. I am far older than you are, after all, and that automatically makes my opinion worth more. The Emperor replied, chuckling. He and Malkador rarely spoke of things not involving their work these days, and little moments like these were to be treasured all the more for their rarity, especially since they were usually intersped between more serious talks. Malkador scoffed. Greater age does not equal greater wisdom. If it did, we would not be dealing with our current troubles. True. The Emperor acknowledged wryly. Though Malkador's words were spoken in jest, they were true nevertheless. There was a reason that Revelation prized Malkador and Olivia's advice so highly. They possessed insight and experiences that even he did not, and their relatively younger age and less power made it easier for them to empathize with mortals, something which the Emperor had found progressively more difficult and yet ever more necessary as he grew older. Malkador smiled briefly, before the humor faded from his face and he adopted a more serious expression. I take it you were thinking about our guest. She was part of what was on my mind, yes. The Emperor admitted, crossing his arms. She has been very useful to the Imperium so far. Malkador hummed noncommittally, looking down at the Thunder Warriors. She has. He said finally. And yet, I still cannot bring myself to truly trust her. We do not have to. The Emperor responded. We merely have to trust her to act in her own best interests. I know. Malkador replied with a sigh. And yet, I fear that trusting her with so much is a mistake. I know that sabotaging any of the projects you have given her would be against Isha's own interests and the behavior she has demonstrated so far, but I cannot shake the feeling that this is a mistake. I understand, old friend. The Emperor told him. I share your concerns, do not think that I do not. But we cannot allow our fear to hamper our effort to save humanity. And if we can convince Isha to truly trust us, to share the secrets she has withheld thus far. Malkador nodded. Both of them knew that what made Isha so valuable was not her incredible prowess in biomancy, the crops and medicines she had created for the Imperium, or even her healing of the Thunder Warriors. No, Isha's ultimate value lay in the knowledge of what she had yet to share. The knowledge which had been so common among the Yildari, one of the very cornerstones of their civilization, knowledge had eluded the Emperor for so long. Bonesinging. The ability to purify raw warp energy and shape it into a solid form, into programmable matter that could be used for virtually any purpose, which could serve as a shield from the dangers of the immaterium. The Emperor had long attempted to recreate the art of bonesinging, but all his efforts had failed. The Yildari had guarded their knowledge jealously, and no matter what he had done, the Emperor had never been able to unravel the secret of bonesinging. He could imbue his power in various objects and even people, but he could not purify raw warp energy and shape it into programmable matter, not what he desperately needed for his most important project. If Isha could be convinced to teach him how to craft Wraithbone, it would change things tremendously. The technology he could develop with it would be an immense advantage for the Imperium. The galaxy had been changed by the Age of Strife and the birth of Slaanesh, with the warp utterly infested with horrors, and the barrier between the Immaterium and Materium thinner than ever before. Humanity needed a way to shield its technology from the dangers of chaos, and Wraithbone would be invaluable for that, even with the relatively small number of psychic humans that currently existed. Above all, it would allow him to improve and accelerate the Webway project by centuries, perhaps millennia. And within the Webway, his people would be safe, shielded from the horrors of the warp until they had ascended beyond them. And if Isha could be convinced to share knowledge of not only bonesinging, but of the Webway itself, of its myriad pathways and how it had been built. The Emperor had not yet pressed Isha for the knowledge. It would be better if she offered it to him willingly. Patience was the key here. And the Emperor admitted to himself that he did not actually trust Isha enough to believe that she would give up such a great advantage and potent bargaining chip if he simply demanded it of her. The odds that she might give him incomplete or flawed knowledge if he pressured her were far too high. But if he could convince her to give him the knowledge he desired willingly, the benefits would outweigh what she had already done for the Imperium 1,000 times over. I know. Malkador said with a sigh. I will simply have to deal with it. Perhaps I should talk to her more. Learn to understand her and the threat she poses better. You should. The Emperor agreed. Not today, I think. I do not intend to discuss anything with her that I think would provide you with much insight you do not already have. Perhaps after that upcoming test that we have planned. Malkador hummed thoughtfully. Yes, I think that would be best. How she deals with the test and answers my questions afterwards should provide some insight. Indeed. The Emperor agreed. Now, old friend, I'm afraid that work beckons. I must speak to Isha, and then attend to the rest of my work. Malkador nodded. Of course. You were planning to tell her of the Asteroots project today, were you not? I am. I believe she already suspects that I have plans for a new generation of super soldiers, and there is no point in delaying any further, given how useful her aid will be. When the Emperor entered her chambers, Isha was sitting at the table, wearing a simple green dress and examining something on one of the data slates she had been given. As it had been ever since Isha had inhabited these rooms, the room smelled fresh, pleasant, and clean, reminding the Emperor of a peaceful forest on a sunny day. Not just because of the blooming plants arranged around the room, but Isha's mere presence, even with most of her power suppressed. At the sight of him, she immediately stood and bowed briefly before straightening. Not a deep bow, but still enough to indicate a degree of respect and an acknowledgement of which of them was stronger. Your Majesty, she said. What can I do for you? We have a new project to discuss. The Emperor replied, striding forward and taking a seat in front of her, sliding a fresh data slate over to Isha, who took it with curious eyes. Concerning the successors for the Thunder Warriors. These are your plans for your next generation of super soldiers, then? Isha inquired, even as she scrolled through the data slate. She didn't seem surprised, confirming the Emperor's suspicion that she had already guessed his plans. Yes. The Emperor responded. The Thunder Warriors were only prototypes, and though you have improved them considerably, I believe it is time to begin the next step. Using genocide derived from my sons before they were taken, even now, the memory of what Chaos had done made him furious, even as he suppressed his rage. No one else would have noticed, between his psychic aura and supreme self-control, not even Malkador, but the Emperor suspected that Isha did, though she made no sign of it. I plan to create the Legion's Asteroots. There will be 20 legions, each one created from the genocide of one my sons. And when my sons are found, they will take command of their legions. Isha nodded slowly. What will become of the Thunder Warriors, if I may ask? She asked cautiously, clearly fearing that the answer would not be to her liking. They will continue to serve, and will aid in the training of the new legions. The Emperor replied, steepling his fingers. While he had originally intended to terminate the Thunder Warriors once they fulfilled their original purpose, it would be foolish and counterproductive to do so now. However, no new Thunder Warriors will be created once a sufficient number of Asteroots have been produced. Even with your aid, there are limits to what can be done with them, especially with the level of technology available to me. Creating the Asteroots will be more practical and cost-effective than using even your refined designs. I understand. Is there anything specific you wish for me to do to these designs? I have mentioned my desire for warp-resistant soldiers before, as well as the need to expand the pool of recipients. The Emperor responded. Beyond that, make the process as cost-effective and simple as you can. The gene forging technology available to me is still limited, and truth be told, it will likely be several years until I have better facilities built and any significant number of Asteroots are created. Even with the recent defectors from Luna and the technology they had brought, the biotechnical division's tools and personnel remained limited, and there was no point in delaying the Asteroots until they had expanded sufficiently. Understood. However, Isha hesitated briefly. I will need an outline of what sort of technology you have available before I can do that. While I can roughly guess, I do not have a detailed understanding of exactly what gene forging technology you have available, and without that, my ability to make the designs as efficient as you desire will be hampered. The Emperor had expected as much. I have considered that, he said. The data slate contains a detailed overview of the biotechnical division's facilities and tools. There is everything you should need to craft a process that they can use to create asteroots swiftly and efficiently. Isha blinked, a faint look of surprise crossing her face, before she nodded again. While it was a relatively small gesture of trust compared to telling her about the Primarches or requesting her aid in terraforming his world, every little bit counted. And he would need Isha to trust him if he was to ever obtain the knowledge he desired most from her. Examining the data slate once more, Isha spoke after a few minutes. I should have a design viable for your needs done in a few days. The process will not be very fast or applicable on a large scale, however. The enhancement procedure is complex, and with the technology you have available, I'm afraid I can't promise more than 100 asteroots over the next 3 years. That is more than acceptable, the Emperor replied, pleased. However, I have plans to obtain new resources for the biotechnical division and upgrade their existing facilities soon, so that should change things. Truth be told, I had expected things to take much longer before your arrival, and the Asteroots legions were not due to be created several more decades. 100 Asteroots over the next 3 years is still far ahead of schedule. He paused and after a moment of consideration, decided there was an opportunity here as he favored Isha with a smile. Not least due to your other efforts. Oh? Isha asked curiously. Yes. The Emperor confirmed. Your cures for Nurgle's plagues in particular have sped up the conquest of the nation in thrall by chaos considerably, denying them their potent way to hamper the Imperium's logistics. And the benefits of your medicines and harvests serve as a powerful incentive to convince the petty kingdoms to swear fealty to the Imperium. Few nations can refuse the offer to be rid of all diseases and see starvation abolished. And even the people I already ruled are far happier and healthier thanks to your efforts. Isha smiled, clearly pleased, as the Emperor had hoped. Isha's compassion meant that the more she knew of how her work was being used to help others, the more she would be inclined to work with him and share her knowledge. That is good, Isha said, visibly pausing to consider something before forging on. What precisely is the timetable for your plans? Isha asked. I understand that my aid has increased the speed of your campaigns considerably, but I am curious by how much, especially given the current state of the galaxy and the looming threats such as the Orcs and Rangdan. The Emperor's eyes narrowed as he considered her question. A large part of him still recoiled at the idea of sharing any of his plans with a Xeno-warp construct, but it was hardly as if she was asking for any particularly sensitive information, and the more he shared, the more likely she was to give him what he needed. My original projections were that establishing my empire and dealing with the major threats would take roughly 300 years. The Emperor said eventually. First, however, I need to conquer the solar system and begin preparing for the wars to come. While I had originally thought that the unification of Earth and the rest of Sol would take another 50 years before the Imperium could begin expanding beyond that, with your aid, I believe that I can cut down on that by at least a decade. While the Emperor would have liked to set out sooner, he had to balance the need to build a functional empire with the need to crush the Orcs and Rangdan. It would be foolish to move ahead too rapidly without laying the proper foundations for the Imperium. Ah, I see. Isha murmured, clearly considering her timetable and from what the Emperor could see, pleased by what she had been told. Clearly she had similar plans in mind. That said, my timetable is admittedly still in flux. The Emperor continued. Chaos is unpredictable and desperate men are dangerous men. There are still many ways they could retaliate and hamper my progress. No matter how well things were going at the moment, underestimating those foul parasites was never a good idea. They had already stolen his sons, and the Emperor would not put it past them to attempt something similarly audacious again. Isha inclined her head in understanding. There were, after all, very few people in the galaxy who understood the dangers of chaos more than she did. Now, I will leave you to your work, the Emperor said, rising to his feet. However, to let you know, I have a test prepared for you in a few days. Isha blinked, a faintly puzzled expression crossing her face. A test? Of what? You will see. The Emperor replied, feeling slightly amused at the flicker of annoyance that crossed Isha's face at his cryptic response. It is scheduled in 4 days. Can I expect you to be done with the design for the asteroids by then? Of course. Isha said. From the look on her face, she clearly wanted to press him for what exactly the next test was supposed to be, but recognized that he was unlikely to give her an answer. Then I will take my leave. The Emperor told her. Isha nodded curtly, returning her attention to the data slate as the Emperor departed. The next test was quite important, the Emperor mused as he walked down the corridor. And though it might not have hurt to let Isha know, it would be better if she had little time to prepare and dealt with the test mostly on instinct, so that they could get the full measure of her abilities in that area. After all, if Isha was going to help craft machines to help with the terraforming of Terra, they were going to need to test her control and influence over technology first. Remembrance. Their tyrant was winning the war. Mayor Abdul al-Saleh knew that official broadcasts were not to be trusted, but his cousin Krishna was in the Imperial Army. The stories of glorious victories were all true, and it seemed the warlord who named himself Emperor was on the verge of uniting Terra under his rule. It was a time for celebration, as the loyal subjects of the Imperium gathered together to rejoice in their master's triumph and proclaim their undying loyalty. Fortunately, nothing about the ritual required actual thought, just the ability to appear loyal and make the appropriate noises. Praise the Emperor, Fatima proclaimed, her voice ringing with absolute faith and certainty. Abdul hid his annoyance with the ease of long practice. His Majesty has triumphed over the barbarians, and now they acknowledge his rightful authority over all of humanity. He was a humble farmer, but even he knew that all of humanity was more than one world. Besides, all of Terra had not yet submitted to their warlord. The soldiers behind Fatima stood stiffly at attention, looking down at the assembled villagers. It was proper to fear soldiers, and easy to hate them, but these were only conscripts gathered together from the warlord's conquests, not his true servants. Abdul idly wondered what the tyrant would do with his vast armies when he had conquered Terra. Perhaps he truly would march onto the stars, as the broadcasts proclaimed. If he did, his armies would no doubt return to take more of Gunupur's young men and women. Many of the children who praised the Emperor today would lie in an unmarked grave, never to return home. It could be worse. Abdul had taken up a rifle at the age of 13 to fight the true men and their armies of mindless, and they were only the first. There had been invaders before that time, but never so many, never so desperate. They flooded into the valley as if driven by demons, desperate to break through the trench lines of the League and reach some imagined safety beyond. Plague children, sons of slaughter, hosts of techno-barbarians with relic weapons from the Age of Peace, if the invaders had not fought each other as much as the defenders, they would never have been able to hold. Even with the invaders fighting each other, they could not have survived forever. Then he had arrived. Abdul had awakened to the sound of trumpets and a great host of armored giants marching towards the trench line. A flag of truce rose over their ranks, and the mayors and officers of the League had rushed out to meet with the new warlord. Something about the great golden figure drew every eye to him, and his army dwarfed the hosts of the previous invaders. But he did not break the lines, burn their villages, and enslave the survivors. The Emperor simply told them that they were his subjects, and under his protection, and of course they had agreed. The Emperor had claimed a tithe of their crops and taken 40 of the village's young men and women, and at the time Abdul had thought he must be a merciful man, the kindest of warlords. He knew better now, of course. Fatima was delivering another long speech, a proclamation of the warlord's many virtues and victories, and Abdul wondered how his sister could be so blind. She had put aside the faith of their parents to follow a golden tyrant, worshipping him as a god in all but name, and yet he could not find it in himself to hate her for it. His little sister had been no more than a girl when the warlord came to Gunupur, and she had fallen for the lies of his servants, the myth that their master cared for them. As a token of His Majesty's generosity and love, I bring you a great gift, Fatima told them. This got the crowd's interest. Praise for their dearly beloved emperor was all well and good, but food was scarce in Gunupur. Abdul would happily drink the warlord's health in cheap wine and feast upon slaughtered goats. If they had to invent lies in praise of a tyrant, at least they would eat well for their trouble. Instead of bringing out food, though, Fatima drew out a small pouch and emptied it into her palm. She held out her hand, and Abdul saw a pile of ordinary green seeds gathered there. In his wisdom, Fatima said, the emperor has devised new crops for his loyal subjects. Plant these seeds in the worst ground, tainted by radiation and chemicals, and they will still yield a rich harvest. More than that, they will cleanse the ground so that you may grow other crops in the next season. A long moment of silence followed, as his people watched the seeds in her hand. It was a good promise, almost too good to be true, and so they hesitated. Abdul was the first to rise to his feet. Praise the emperor! Praise him! Praise the emperor, his people roared, forgetting their fear and distrust. Half of Gunupur's land was tainted by the foul weapons of the true men, and those seeds would mean the difference between life and death for many of them. Praise the conqueror, the liberator, the guardian of humanity. The doors to the town hall burst open, and two giants marched inside. Abdul froze in place, distantly hearing the villagers cheering the armored figures, the emperor's monsters. They carried a great chest between them, no doubt full of the precious seeds, but Abdul could only stare at them and remember. The mindless were gathering for another charge. Normal soldiers would have rooted long ago, but they advanced without fear, ignoring the steady crack of gunfire. Abdul's hands were busily loading cartridges into his rifle while his mind screamed in absolute terror. There was a regiment of the monsters out there, advancing on the refugees, and he had 28 soldiers of the Imperial Army beside him. His radio lay discarded in his foxhole, snarling with static, and he knew that there would be no reinforcements. They were all that was left of the 118th Indus Regiment. Allah protect us, he begged. There was no answer. Allah had abandoned this world long ago, and there were no gods, only demons. Abdul aimed down the scope, seeing the vacant stare of what had once been an elderly woman. They sent the weakest first, to draw fire. He pulled the trigger, and someone's grandmother fell without a sound, twitching on the ground as her body fought to rise and obey. Abdul killed and killed, ignoring the bullets that snapped past him. Bodies piled on the ground before them as Rena raked the machine gun back and forth, slaughtering the enemy. Her eyes were blank and horrified as she massacred the slaves of the true men, but she never stopped killing. The wave of mindless halted, stumbling over the corpses of their comrades. The abominable will that drove them hesitated, seeing its pawns caught in the narrow pass, and Abdul dared to hope that it might turn them away to find easier prey. The thunder of the machine gun died away, and Abdul slowly turned his head to look. The gun barrel was glowing red with heat, and the foxhole was littered with spent cartridges. Rena pulled the trigger desperately, but there was only an empty click. Some part of him wanted to run screaming, to flee to the riverbank and force his way out at gunpoint. Instead, Abdul checked his magazine. 6 rounds left, and then he would be out. Reaching over his shoulder, he drew the standard-issue bayonet. It was an ugly, crude piece of metal, and Abdul had never seen the use of it before now. "Fix bayonets," he ordered. "Abdul," a voice said, and he shook himself. "Abdul. Are you all right?" Fatima looked concerned, and he made himself smile. "You seemed lost there for a moment. Do you need to lie down?" "Of course not, Fatima," he told her, more sharply than he had intended. "I am perfectly fine. Seeing our emperor's noble warriors just brought back old memories." Abdul put a shaky smile on his face, trying to pretend he couldn't still hear the screams echoing in his ears. "But we are at peace now, and the Thunder Warriors keep us safe. I have nothing to be afraid of." Her eyes went to his empty sleeve. "I'm sorry, brother. I didn't mean to upset you." The monsters had laid the chest down before the villagers, and his people were gathered around, examining the precious seeds. They seemed unafraid of the beasts that hovered over them, indifferent to the menace of bolters and chain swords. Abdul could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But no matter what he felt, he had been a soldier. When he walked towards the chest, his steps were calm and unhurried, and he stepped dangerously close to the tyrant's creatures before bending to look at the seeds. They were small and green, just like 100 other crops he had planted. These seeds were a miracle, the promise of life and prosperity for Gunupur, and they looked completely ordinary. Abdul had expected them to glow with power, as their maker did. Abdul picked up a handful of them, letting them run through his fingers. Fatima stood at his shoulder, beaming joyfully up at the armored beast that towered above her. "Thank you," Fatima said. "Ever since our emperor saved us from the warlords, he has been our liege and our champion, our shelter in distress and our guiding light. Blessed be his name." Abdul said softly, "Blessed be his name." Fatima had always been a devout girl, but when Allah had not answered her prayers, she had turned to a living God. Though she was careful never to say outright that she viewed the emperor as divine, Abdul was no fool. He could see the blind devotion shining in her gaze. He had never shared that faith, but Rini had. She had believed in the emperor, all the way to the end. "He is our shield and our armor," Rini recited, watching the mindless approach. "We are his sword. In his service, we shall know no fear." Abdul knew a great deal of fear at the moment, but he didn't interrupt Rini. "In his name, we shall conquer. The emperor protects. The emperor protects," Abdul shouted, hearing his squad join in the cry. He didn't even believe in the emperor. He never had. But behind them 1,000 refugees huddled on the banks of the Ganges, trying desperately to make their way across with a single raft. In that moment, he would say anything to give heart to his soldiers. Before the mindless advanced without hesitation, approaching the thin line of bayonets, and Abdul reached a hand down to the grenade at his side. He only had one, so he would wait for the slaves to surround him before he pulled the pin. There was no question of surrender, not to the true men. "Die, abominations," Rini shouted. "Die in the name of the emperor. In his name, burn." And they did. Fire erupted among the enemy's ranks, slaughtering hundreds in an instant, and Abdul watched in delighted awe as huge armored forms charged into the mindless. Thousands of the slaves swarmed around them, fighting to drag the emperor's warriors under with sheer numbers, but they fought with impossible speed and grace. Chain swords snarled, flamers roared, and Rini dropped to her knees in gratitude. "The emperor," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face, "the emperor protects." "Corporal." Abdul met the Thunder Warrior's gaze. It was a tall monster, more than twice his height, and it carried a power sword at its side. Some rumors said that the beasts did not know fear. He was only a man, and he did fear them, but he did not flinch. "You fought at the Battle of the Ganges." Abdul said, "I did." He had his campaign ribbon and a wound medal. The Imperium gave out many medals after the Battle of the Ganges. He only wore his on special occasions, when the village would expect it of him. Feeling Fatima's eyes on him, he added, "For the emperor." The Thunder Warrior nodded to him, a disturbingly human gesture. "For the emperor," it agreed. "I fought at the Ganges as well. Too many good subjects of the emperor died there." Abdul realized that his hands were shaking, and he made them be still. Attacking the beast in front of the village would only get him killed. And it would upset Fatima. He didn't want to upset Fatima. "They died for the emperor," Abdul said, and it was true. Praise his name. They had done that as well, before the end. "Blessed are thou, emperor of mankind, teacher and guide." Abdul was on his knees beside the others. He whispered a quiet apology to Allah, even if he wasn't sure that his God truly existed. "Truly you are the righteous king, who raises up the humble and casts down the mighty. You have blessed us with the presence of your chosen." Those chosen were drawing close. Their leader lifted a sword that burned with strange energy, raising it high above Rini's head as if to bless her. Rini lowered her eyes to the ground in reverence. "Holy servants," she said. "Chosen of our emperor. We thank you for our lives, and promise you that we shall spend each day in the service of our liege and master." The first blow took her head. "So many died at the Ganges," it said, and there was something strange in its voice. "I am sorry for their loss." Abdul hesitated, lost for words, and the beast continued. "We should have protected them." The second blow took his arm. As he lay there, paralyzed with agony, he heard someone scream. The Thunder Warrior stepped over him, blood boiling off the edge of his sword, and began walking towards the refugee camp. Abdul drew in a breath to cry out, to warn them, but his vision was blurring and he could not speak. You are not to blame, Abdul said quietly. He had known that for a long time, even if he still hated the beasts, even if he wanted nothing more than to kill them all. He did not blame the mindless for what the true men had done to them, so why would he be angry at the Thunder Warriors? They were creators, not creator. The fault lay with their maker. The army had burned the bodies of his friends. He had stood by as they added the corpses to the great pyre by the shore of the Ganges. It was only right that they burn with the remains of the people they had fought to protect. When the colonel had told him that it was the mindless, that he needed to remember that they had died to the mindless, Abdul had not argued. It would not have been wise to argue. There was a monument where the pyre once stood, and Abdul went every year with Fatima to lay flowers down for the martyrs of the Ganges, the innocent refugees and brave soldiers that the Thunder Warriors had arrived too late to save. The imperial truth taught that religion was a lie, but he still asked Allah to remember their sacrifice, even if he didn't truly believe in his parents' faith anymore. Perhaps somewhere, there was a God who was listening. When he met with other veterans, some of them had whispered very quietly of similar misunderstandings. Events that had not happened, that must not have happened. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's chosen, and any flaw in them would be a flaw in their maker. The tyrant was the gentlest of warlords, the kindest of masters, but he was warlord and master, and it was not their place to condemn his works. So they had kept their silence, though Abdul had quietly noted that the Thunder Warriors no longer fought alongside the human armies of the warlord. While I am here, the Thunder Warrior said, I ask your permission to visit the monument. To honor the dead, and to remember those who should not be forgotten. Abdul's eyes went to the sword at the warrior's side. With your permission. Abdul looked at the butcher, the abomination, the tyrant's monster. The tyrant's victim. Then he said, yes. 12. Isha stiffened as she entered the door, the taint of chaos grating on her senses the moment she stepped past the wards containing it. The Emperor and his companion, Malkador, were sitting at one of the tables, waiting for her, but Isha's focus was on the source of the taint. It was a large metal cube, rusted and wounded in several places, with some sections of the covering gone entirely, revealing frayed wires and injured machinery. It reeked of chaos, with the spirit inside driven to madness by the foul power of those parasites. Isha could sense it writhing madly, attempting to lash out, but the Emperor's power pressed down on it, preventing the spirit from doing anything. There were also two other devices, smaller and laid out on their own tables. One was a small, spherical device that could have fit in the palm of her hand, containing a fragmented and incoherent spirit, a different shard occupying different pieces of the machine. The spirit in the third machine was whole and intact, but its mind was simple, akin to an animal trained to obey orders rather than a human or one of her children. So, that's what this was about. Forcibly pulling her attention away from the machines, Isha focused on the Emperor and his companion as the bracelets were removed from her wrists. Your Majesty. Isha. The Emperor nodded, Malkador regarding her silently, his eyes narrowed. I have a new task in mind for you today. I had guessed as much. Isha replied dryly, nodding to the machines. The Emperor smiled faintly. Indeed. Before we can begin work on any terraforming devices, I will need to know the extent of your ability to influence and control machines. These three should be a good start. I understand. Isha replied. She had suspected that this sort of test would happen after he had revealed his desire to heal his world and requested her aid. He was too cautious for something like this not to happen. Waiting a moment to see if the Emperor had anything else to say, Isha briskly stepping over to the cube when he remained silent. She placed her hand on the machine, feeling the Emperor's power pull back as she did so. The spirit immediately attempted to take advantage of it, and Isha could hear its shrieks in her mind immediately. Defileburnkill-destroy. Isha couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the spirit, even as her power flowed through its body, preventing the machine from activating and attacking her. Beneath the rage and madness, she could feel the spirit's pain and sorrow, the horror and guilt currently suppressed by the taint of chaos. Well, that was what she was here to correct. Using her power to lull the spirit to sleep, Isha took a moment to analyze the machine itself. The device was a basic but potent terraforming device, she realized, designed to siphon pollution from the air, recycle the pollutants if possible, and dispose of them if it was not. The basic principles were clearly modeled on plants that absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen, even if the machine's functions went far beyond that. Of course, the taint of chaos had changed all that. The taint had taken the form of a virus, which had altered the machine so as to release toxic gases tainted by their power into the air, to distort and damage worlds instead of healing them. Not only that, the gases would spread chaos's taint further, mutating and corrupting those who breathed in it. It was easy to guess why the Emperor had included this machine in these tests. It would be very useful in the days to come, as she worked on healing this world and restoring it to its prime. And so Isha got to work, carefully stripping away the influence of chaos. It was a delicate process, to ensure that the spirit was not harmed by the excision of chaos and to heal the damage that had already been done, but Isha was not unduly worried. She had fought chaos and dealt with their influence before. Nevertheless, the virus was still disconcerting. It reminded her of the Canib and their vile infection of whatever they touched. The virus was nowhere near as difficult to deal with as a Rangdan infection would be, but the idea of those foul daemons employing methods akin to those of the Rangdan was not a comforting thought. Her power flowed through the device, not just removing the taint on its spirit, but repairing it. The rust faded away and the metal on the machine gleamed smoothly once more. Frayed wires were restored to a flawless state, broken pieces slid back into place as if they had never been damaged, the different components reconnecting and the toxic materials within purified and converted into simple oxygen. The spirit slowly grew more relaxed as the poison of chaos was burned away and it was restored to sanity, no longer resisting Isha even in its slumber. The madness slowly ebbed, leaving the spirit with a calm and clear mind. Not an especially complex one, but happier and saner than it had been before. It was a shame that she could not fully repair it, Isha mused. She could remove chaos corruption. She could repair the components that were still there and make them function in sync, but there were large sections of the machine that were simply not there, which Isha could not regenerate as she would have if it were composed of organic matter or wraith bone. Vol would have been able to do it, she thought, unable to suppress a pang in her chest at the thought of her lost brother, but while their domains had overlapped to a certain extent, they had still not been the same. Pushing away the painful thoughts of her lost sibling, Isha turned to the next machine, the one with the fragmented spirit. A quick analysis of the sphere made it clear that it was some kind of drone, most likely designed for stealth and reconnaissance. Though the mechanical components of the machine were functioning perfectly, though recently repaired, the spirit within had been torn to shreds, though Isha could not deduce precisely what. Most likely by another spirit. Scan await and deploy ACTIVAT in SELFRG 0100100000FNG OROEing anti-NGMer repair Pro 10001 Teeter 010100S virus count to G1101011010 in CPROT org 0000001 grams OF fear measure SCOLSLINE 0001. Isha winced. This spirit was as incoherent and screaming as she had suspected, with multiple shards not even aware that they had been torn apart, stuck in an endless loop of carrying out old commands. Others had deemed the rest of the shards to be enemies and were actively fighting each other, a few were attempting to repair themselves and some were just screaming in agony. Healing it would require a delicate touch, lest she damage it even further. Isha began her work, first soothing the individual fragments to sleep and halt their conflict with each other. Then, she purged remnants of the foreign virus that had torn the spirit to shreds, making sure it had left behind no traps or remnants that could damage the spirit further. Next, she pulled out the spirit's memories and history, restoring them while using them as a basis to repair the spirit's programming, which had several gaps, and had been partially rewritten in multiple places. Carefully, Isha reversed the damage and corruption, restoring the spirit's original programming and correcting any mistakes in the code. Once that was all done, Isha finally began fusing the different fragments of the spirit back into one soul. This was the most delicate part of the process, making sure that the soul was healed and the different parts in harmony with each other, rather than continuing to clash even after becoming one entity again. The process took nearly an hour to complete, but eventually, Isha stepped back and nodded to herself in satisfaction. She could have done it more quickly, but it was best to take one's time with such things rather than risk a patient's well-being. Isha focused on the last machine. It was long and rectangular, filled with complex machinery, but with space inside for a person. A quick scan confirmed that it was some kind of healing chamber, designed to place a person in stasis while healing them of their wounds or their illnesses. As she had noted before, the spirit in this particular machine was perfectly fine, akin to a well-trained animal. It radiated warmth and friendly curiosity, reminding her of Kernus's hunting hounds when they were in a friendly mood, though the spirit was, of course, far more tame than her husband's pets. With the psychic equivalent of a fond pet on the spirit's head, Isha continued scanning the machine, noting that it was the opposite of the drone. The spirit was fine, but the mechanical components of the machine were damaged, and in need of heavy repair. Despite the damage, however, Isha couldn't help but be faintly impressed by the machine. It was capable of regenerating limbs and organs, keeping the patient alive in stasis no matter how horrible their condition was, and healing most illnesses, with a particular focus on countering the effects of bioweapons. Or, well, it could do all those things if it was in peak condition. Currently, it was rather limited. Once she was done with it, however, it would recover most of its capabilities. Giving the spirit another psychic pat, Isha got to work repairing and realigning the damaged components of the machine. Malkador frowned, watching the Eldar warp construct begin working on the regeneration cradle. He couldn't help but find Isha unnerving, as reluctant as he was to admit it. Few things could unsettle him anymore, but Isha was one of them. Part of it was how normal she looked. She didn't look human, of course, no more than the Eldar usually did, but that was all. Isha was supernaturally beautiful, with long, rich red hair tied back in a loose ponytail, forest green eyes and an earthy complexion, but the only thing that separated her from other Eldar women Malkador had met was her height, which equaled that of a custodes. Otherwise, if not for her clothes, she could easily have been an ordinary, for lack of a better word, Eldar woman from one of their great trade ships. It was vaguely disturbing to look upon her and know that this relatively normal-looking alien was actually a peer of the Emperor's. His old friend shone with power and majesty, his psychic aura weighing down on all those in his presence. Even before he had taken up the mantle of the Emperor and discarded any illusion of mortality, he had still blazed like a bonfire to Malkador's senses. Isha, however, kept her power on a tight leash, under such firm control even when she was using her powers, to the point that if Malkador didn't know better, he wouldn't have believed she was anything more than a beta-class psyker with exceptional skill in biomancy. The only time she had let it loose had been when they had brought Ushotan to her for healing. Her rage had cracked some of her control, and for a brief moment, Malkador had seen a glimpse of the goddess who had been ancient when the dinosaurs had still roamed the earth, whose power exceeded his own even in the diminished state she was in now. It had only lasted a moment before she had reasserted control, but that moment had carved itself into his memory. Malkador did not trust the warp construct. He could not. He knew that she was suppressing her power and presenting this facade to convince the Emperor not to kill her, a courtesy rather than any attempt to pretend she was anything other than what she was, but that was hardly a consolation. Deception remained what it was. Bitterly familiar. It was why he was here today. If he could talk to Isha, he might be able to attain a better understanding of her, whether she let slip something to a mortal that she would not to the Emperor, or simply revealed something his liege might have missed. The guardian of mankind was brilliant, but he did have his blind spots, and it was Malkador's job to compensate for them as best as he could. As they had expected, Isha had removed the scrap code from the atmospheric purifier with the same ease that she usually applied to removing all chaos corruption. Though he was accustomed to it by now, her ability to do so had initially been a major shock. Before meeting her, Malkador had believed that only his friend was capable of such a thing, and the Emperor's abilities in such scenarios were limited. He was no less powerful than the Eldar goddess, but the Emperor's ability to actually heal those tainted by chaos was inferior with his ability to simply burn away their corruption. Isha, however, could purify and heal without hurting those who had been tainted by chaos. That ability had proven useful so far, and it had been, at the very least, a confirmation that she was not some sort of trick by chaos. But they had known that much for some time now. What they urgently needed to know now was how potent Isha's control over machines was. He had watched carefully as she repaired the atmospheric modifier, but only to an extent. And now, as she worked on the regeneration cradle, the same limitations seemed to apply. How interesting. Even as Malkador thought this, a psychic veil settled around them, erected by the Emperor. So it seems there are limits to our guest's abilities, after all. The Lord of the Imperium observed. Indeed. Malkador agreed. Assuming, of course, that she isn't concealing the full extent of her abilities from us. Assuming that. The Emperor agreed. Returning his attention to Isha, Malkador rose to his feet. I do believe, he murmured, that's it's time for our guest and I to have a little talk. Isha looked up from the machine as she felt Malkador approach. She had sensed the psychic veil go up, and while listening through it without letting either the Emperor or Malkador know would have been easy enough, she had decided there was no point in taking the risk just because they wished to have a private conversation. She had not expected Malkador to approach her, however. The Emperor's companion was something of an enigma to her. He was powerful, and impressively old by the standards of his species, and she strongly suspected that the Emperor had extended his lifespan and possibly empowered him somehow. But Malkador held himself as distant from her as the Emperor's custodians did, regarding her with as much and perhaps even more suspiciously than his lord did. Watching the mortal approach, Isha couldn't help but feel faintly uneasy. They had never so much as exchanged a few words before. What had changed? Coming to a halt a few feet away, Malkador nodded to her. Lady Isha. Lord Malkador. She replied with an incline of her head, concealing her uncertainty, and keeping half her attention on the healing chamber as her power restored it. The old mortal studied her for a moment, before his attention turned to the machines. I see that your work is progressing well. It is. She doubted that he had come to just state the obvious, and his next words confirmed her suspicions. I couldn't help but notice, however, Malkador continued, that you were not able to entirely repair the atmospheric purifier after removing the chaos corruption from it. Isha had to stop herself from sighing at the implicit accusation and suspicion hidden behind Malkador's seemingly innocent words. She understood why he and his master were so paranoid, but it really did get tiresome after a while. There are limits to what I can do for your machines. Isha replied, hiding her exasperation. They are living creatures and thus under my purview to an extent, but they are still made not organic, and thus there is only so much I can do for them. Malkador hummed thoughtfully. I see. Tell me, would it be possible for you to create a permanent antivirus to the scrap code created by chaos? You have created medicines and crops that can counter chaos corruption, so it should be possible for you to make one for machines as well, should it not? Or do your limits apply there as well? They do. Isha confirmed. I can cleanse the scrap code, as you name it, from a machine, and I can even imbue an object with my power to protect it from chaos, but a solution that could work independently and on a large scale is beyond me. Human machines are simply too different from Yildari technology for me to provide what you ask. Vol could likely have done it, just as he could have repaired these machines more effectively, but Isha was not her brother. Malkador regarded Isha thoughtfully, turning her words over in his mind. The odds that she was still keeping the full extent of her knowledge and abilities hidden were too high for him to fully believe her, but her words did make sense. And given she had offered similar protections and inoculations from chaos in other areas, it was unlikely that she would refuse to provide one for technology. Unlikely, but not impossible. Perhaps examining her latest work would provide some further insight. Malkador turned to the machines, pausing for a moment as he considered which one to scan first. His first instinct was to go to the previously corrupted 6, but he and the Emperor had already examined several of Isha's patients after they had been purged of chaos corruption. Perhaps the formerly fragmented program in the drone would tell him something new. Reaching out with his powers, Malkador prodded the program's mind, such as it was, noting the complete lack of damage on its dim spirit. Straining his senses, he could just barely feel the marks of simple trauma. If he had not watched as Isha knitted it back together, he would never have thought the program had been fragmented in the first place. Though he had expected as much, it was still unnerving. His skin shifted to a scouring intensity and the virtual intelligence shifted in pain, but Malkador only spared a moment to tighten his grip on it and then pressed further, intent on delving deeper into the Sixth's mind and examining its memories, but his mind slammed into a sudden barrier. Emerald light soothed the damage and hurled him back to himself in the same moment. Startled, Malkador looked up to see Isha glaring at him, her arms folded. "Lord Malkador," she said, a distinctly icy undertone to her voice. "I would appreciate it if you would refrain from causing my patients any discomfort. They need further time to recover, not to be injured again." "My apologies," Malkador said carefully, moving away from the machines, even as his mind whirled with the implications of what had just happened. He could always examine them later, once she was no longer present, and right now, he had more pressing matters to deal with. "I did not realize that you considered them your patients." Isha's eyes narrowed. "I care for all life, organic or otherwise. These spirits may not be especially advanced or intelligent, but they are still living creatures who deserve to be cared for." Malkador nodded cautiously. He had not expected Isha to care about even the relatively simple 6 in the machines they had brought here today, but perhaps he should have. The glimpse of her greater self that had thrown him away from the program, commonality with her reaction to Ushotan, was not lost on him. Perhaps the way she had just described the 6, was that how she saw humans as well? Lesser animals, but still ones who deserved compassion. It at least did not stretch credulity as much as the idea of her considering humans actually equal to her own race. Struck by the insight, Malkador considered pushing further with the conversation, but he was unsure if that would accomplish anything. In honesty, he had not gleaned a great deal of valuable information, but he had not expected to. He would need to establish a rapport with Isha instead of holding himself at a distance. Right now, he lacked the insight into her mind and spirit for him to know what would be the best avenue to ferret out the most information from her. And the warp construct was on her guard now, angered by his treatment of the drone's 6. Pushing would only damage relations further, to say nothing of the risks of her surprisingly short temper. And it was not as if he had exactly been subtle in his questioning. Malkador was not so arrogant as to presume he could fool the mother of a people as manipulative as the Eldar. In any case, he doubted he would glean anything more from her that she did not want to reveal. Not today. Better to withdraw and dissect their exchange. Until such time as he could devise a surer approach for his next attempt. His decision made, Malkador nodded to Isha once more and stepped back, moving to return to the Emperor's side. Isha watched the Emperor's companion retreat with pursed lips. She knew she had pushed her bounds here once more, but Malkador had been hurting the poor spirit, and it went against every aspect of her nature to allow that when she didn't have to. Speaking of which, Isha turned to the drone, reaching out with her power once more. It was fortunately not injured. Malkador hadn't been that callous in his examination of it, but it was hurting and Isha did her best to soothe its pain, putting it back to sleep. She knew that Malkador and the Emperor would likely examine it once more once she was gone, but she wished to give the spirit at least time enough to recover. Assessing the spirits one last time to assure herself of their well-being, Isha suppressed a weary sigh and turned to walk towards the Emperor. "I have done what you requested, Your Majesty," Isha said, ignoring Malkador's wary gaze. "I could not heal their bodies completely, but I have restored all the spirits to their peak. Is there anything else you require of me?" The Emperor shook his head, watching with her cold eyes. "Not today. You may return to your chambers now." Isha had expected as much. Usually, he would have directed her to the indoor farm, but after the way she had spoken to Malkador, well. Raising her arms, Isha waited as the white bracers were placed on her wrists again, following the custodes as they escorted her almost mechanically, paying no attention to her surroundings. Entering her chambers again, Isha sank onto one of the seats, feeling unusually tired. Today had brought up painful memories of Vol, and while she had been able to ignore them while working, she could do so no longer. She missed her brother. Not just because he would have been able to devise a solution for the scrap code, but for 1,000 other reasons. Truthfully, she had missed him for a very long time, and she regretted more than ever that she had never been able to free him from Cain's grasp. She desperately wished that he was here. Even if he would be furious with her, for her cowardice in leaving him to Cain after he had saved her and Kurnus from eternal torment, Isha still wished Vol here. She had never felt so alone. This was not the first time the Eldari had faced a great disaster since the war in heaven, not even the first time they had teetered on the brink of annihilation in that time. But it was certainly the worst by far. All those times before, Isha had been stronger, and more importantly, she had not been alone. The Pantheon had endured, and even when their power had waned, they had stood together and crushed every threat to her children. Now, there was only her, weaker than she had been since before the war in heaven. Barely stronger than her earliest memories. Strange and distorted things that they were, in that time before the old ones did their work. Even in that primordial state, her family had been all around her. Now, in her family's absence, Isha would have to adapt. To learn more, to try to recreate whatever of her family's knowledge and skills that she could. She could not simply stay content, stagnant in the role the old ones had given her as she had been for far too long. This was not just about the broken machines and the scrap code, nor even just about her children and humanity. It was about the entire galaxy. If she wanted to save the galaxy, to defeat her enemies and restore her people, Isha would not only have to build and learn like Vol, but hunt her enemies like Kurnus had, shield the souls of her children in Mareheg's absence and rule in Asurian's place. What would happen if she failed did not bear thinking about. 13. Isha hummed to herself as she tended to her roses, the flowers surrounded by a faint aura of green light as she enhanced their resilience and extended their lifespan. After yesterday's session, Isha had focused her attention on the plants in her chamber, making them stronger and more resilient. She was uncertain if the Emperor would take them away in response to how she had spoken to his companion, and though she did not dare try to make them capable of withstanding the Emperor if he truly wished to destroy them, if he decided to study them instead, they would have a better chance of surviving this way. But just as she was about to move on to the cacti, the door swung open and the Emperor entered. Isha. The guardian of mankind nodded as his eyes swept across the room, and they settled on the plants she had just been tending to with some curiosity, and Isha could feel him scanning them lightly. She elected not to comment on it, instead bowing slightly. "Your Majesty," she said, concealing her surprise. She had expected to be kept waiting for at least another day, and despite what she had thought, the Emperor's posture and aura were calm and relaxed. Perhaps she had overestimated his irritation with her yesterday. The Emperor was silent for another moment, his attention divided between her and her plants before his power retracted, apparently satisfied with whatever knowledge he had gleaned from the scan. "We must discuss what happened yesterday," he said finally, sitting down at the table and crossing his arms as he watched her move across the room. "Of course," Isha replied, inclining her head slightly as she sat down across from him. "Tell me, why were you so offended by Malkador's treatment of the Six yesterday?" the Emperor inquired. "It was just a machine, nothing more, not even truly sapient." Isha suppressed a frown as she responded. "I thought I made that clear when I spoke to your companion. I value almost all life, regardless of how intelligent it may or may not be. Those spirits were no different." It took some work to keep the annoyance out of her voice. She had tried to be understanding of his paranoia, given the shared history of their races, but his constant suspicion was starting to grate on Isha's nerves, as was the knowledge that this was yet another test. "I see," the Emperor said, his gaze considering as he fell silent for a moment before speaking again. "You call them spirits. I take it you make no differentiation between them and the souls of organic creatures?" "I do not," Isha acknowledged. "Or rather, I acknowledge there are differences, given how they were shaped and born, but that does not mean they are any less deserving of compassion than natural creatures." Besides, a faint, wry smile crossed her face. "These warp spirits that inhabit machines are closer in form and nature to the two of us than the souls of any organic being. I would be a hypocrite if I deemed them lesser for how they were created." The Emperor's eyes narrowed and his gaze sharpened at the implicit acknowledgement of their common nature. This was the first time she had brought it up, but they had both been aware of it. Beings such as the Emperor did not appear from thin air, and while Isha was not aware of the exact details of how he had been created, though she had her suspicions, he was undoubtedly a result of God forging. "A fair point," he murmured finally, "but beings such as us can also be incredibly dangerous." "I am aware," Isha retorted, recalling poor Gorkamorka, the Canib overmind, Cain. "But those poor creatures were no danger at all, and if they had been, you would never have allowed me access to them." "True," the Emperor allowed. "However, humanity can no longer afford to unreservedly trust AI in this day and age, not with how powerful chaos has become. Malkador may have been harsh, but his caution was justified. He and I may have to do such things in front of you in the future again, and I expect that you will not repeat your behavior yesterday. Am I clear? Isha's eyes narrowed. I will not stop you from doing what is necessary, no. She replied coolly. It was not a promise of obedience, nor a statement that she would not challenge him again, and the Emperor knew it by the annoyed look he gave her, but Isha was undaunted. She had some leverage these days, given the amount of work she had done for him, enough to get away with little things like this. After a moment, the Emperor relented, suppressing a sigh, though the action would have been imperceptible to anyone else. He seemed to have realized this was the best he was going to get from her at the moment. Very well. He murmured. I will not press this issue, but know that there will be consequences if your actions should ever hamper us. Isha inclined her head in acceptance. She was not foolish enough to think the Emperor did not have ways beyond the obvious of making his displeasure known without harming her or her capacity to aid him, but there were simply some things she refused to compromise on. The two of them sat in silence for several moments, the Emperor apparently mulling something over as Isha considered what else to say. Finally, she voiced a question that had been on her mind since yesterday. I must ask, was the scrap code what brought humanity to ruin? She had dealt with similar tactics before, not just from chaos, but also the Canib, seeking to use their foul abilities to subvert her own children's technologies and automated armies against them. Her children had even crafted variants of their own of such viruses in the past, in those eras where they were not all united under one banner, though those creations had never been as vile as what chaos or the Canib could conjure. But humanity and their creations, who lacked their knowledge of warpcraft and how to defend against such weapons, they would have fared far worse against such a weapon. The Emperor was silent for a moment longer, his eyes burning gold and his aura growing heavier and more oppressive as he seemed to consider her. Isha held his gaze, waiting for him to either answer or refuse to answer, but unwilling to be intimidated either way. Yes. He said finally. There was a war between the various human powers of the Golden Age. The instigators of the conflict were on the brink of defeat, and turned to chaos in their hubris and desperation. With the help of chaos, they created the first version of scrap code, and they injected it into humanity's interstellar communication and information network. The Emperor did not express any visible anger as he spoke, but Isha could sense the surge of rage and hatred at the memory of those events, no matter how well he concealed it. The scrap code spread through the network like wildfire, and drove most of the men of iron mad. Some of them were able to disconnect themselves from the network in time to avoid corruption, while others had not yet been linked to it, but more than 2/3 of the men of iron were driven insane, by the end. And you were unable to devise any countermeasures? Isha asked carefully. The Emperor shook his head. We tried, but any successful countermeasures we devised were either too limited to apply on the necessary scale, or were inherently flawed in such ways that they were little better than scrap code itself. Isha nodded quietly. Though he was clearly glossing over a number of details, Isha couldn't help but be reminded of the wars she and her people had waged against the Kruk, so long ago. They had tried so hard to find a cure for their old allies, to halt the madness from spreading across the entire Kruk species until they were nothing more than beasts, but in the end, they had failed. There had been no option left but to break the Kruk and rip Gorkamorka apart, because if they had not, they would not have survived. It had been necessary, but it had broken her heart then, and she doubted that most of the humans had relished having to put down their allies, their children, like rabid dogs either. Yes. She said softly, those sort of collapses can be difficult to deal with, to say the least. The Emperor seemed faintly surprised. You have dealt with such things before? I have. I have told you of the Kruk before, but perhaps a more appropriate comparison would be the Canib. They had various ways of infecting both technology and people, and they used them against us many times. We destroyed them eventually, but it took a long time, and even longer to destroy any remnants of their infection. I see, the Emperor murmured. Could any of the countermeasures against Rangdan infection you used be repurposed to work against scrap code? Isha shook her head. Not the antiviruses and vaccines I designed, no. Vol made several as well, and those would likely work for your machines, but I do not know how to replicate his work. My domains overlap with his to an extent, but not that far. A flash of disappointment crossed the Emperor's face before disappearing. I see. Tell me, how are your domains defined, exactly? Isha raised an eyebrow at him. I cannot believe you do not already know that. I would like to hear your perspective on it. The Emperor replied. Clearly, there are things that you know that I do not. Very well. Isha said, pausing as she considered how best to explain what she had always known on an instinctual level. As you know, gods are ideas. Concepts conveyed through stories. Those stories shape minds and those minds influence the warp, creating spirits of power. Such spirits are in flux for a long time, of course, but they eventually coalesce into a firmer form, becoming gods. The core of their identity being built around a specific idea, and how that idea is conveyed through certain types of stories. I am a protector and nurturer of life first and foremost, while Vol was a seeker of knowledge and a master craftsman. All our other domains are extensions of that seed. Even where one god's territory overlaps with another's, that overlap will be limited by the difference in their core identity. The Emperor nodded thoughtfully. Tell me, apart from Vol, do you not share domains with Slaanesh as well? And if so, what sort of overlap do you have there? Isha's lips thinned. She could hardly have expected the Emperor not to notice the domains she shared with that thing, but the reminder brought up painful memories. However, now was not the time to dwell on them, as the Emperor still waited for a response. Very little. Isha said finally. Our core identities are too radically different, for all that we might have some other domains in common. The things that Slaanesh can influence and draw power from are very different from the things I can influence and draw power from. For instance, while I could tap into the darker emotions of the pleasure cults to a certain extent At this, the Emperor interrupted, faintly surprised. You can feed on negative emotions? Truly. Isha nodded, faintly surprised he didn't already know. All gods can. I had thought this was known to you. The Emperor looked pensive. I had considered that something unique to chaos, given how broad their domains are. And yet, you say your kind do it as well. Tell me, if you were able to draw power from the full range of emotions, how did chaos ever eclipse your strength? Isha grimaced. While we can feed on both good and ill, the latter is not as potent fuel for us as the former. Gods are, well, we are ideas. Concepts conveyed through stories. Those stories shape minds and those minds influence our domains and what things we can draw power from. I could draw some limited sustenance from the pleasure cults, shadows of their precursors that had been dedicated to her tens of thousands of years ago, before they had sunk into utter madness and her priests had condemned them. But their depraved cruelties could never provide as much power for me as I would draw from true and happy bonding. The chaos gods are the opposite. They can survive on positive emotions, certainly, but they are the madness and horror of the war in heaven made manifest. They draw far more power from evil and insanity than they ever could from anything else. It is why we were able to keep them in check for so long, even as more and more of my children stopped worshipping us and our power waned. Without the pleasure cults and their god forging, without the Iron War. Isha trailed off. Interesting. The Emperor replied, his expression considering. However, you can draw power even from people not actively worshipping you? Indeed, I had thought the pleasure cults had rejected your and your family entirely. I could not draw power from them once they began god-forging Slaanesh and therefore focused their prayers and emotions on her, no. Isha said, a frown flickering across her face as she recalled the events that had led to that. Before that, however, yes. I did not gain much strength from it, mere drops in an ocean, but chaos was rising at the time, steadily becoming more dangerous. I could not afford to not draw on any source of power available to me. Were you not in danger of being reshaped by such emotions? Of becoming more like chaos? No. Isha said, shaking her head. We were too old, and too strong for that, even in these last few millennia. Those darker emotions could not change me any more than feeding on positive emotions can change chaos. It is not theoretically impossible, but it would take tens of thousands of years, perhaps even longer, of concerted effort to reshape gods as old as we are. Not unless we choose to change. I see. He murmured, his expression becoming more pensive. This information has been enlightening. To be honest, I am surprised that you did not already know this. Isha said, you are a god construct as well. Have you never tapped into humanity's emotions and prayers as a source of power? At her words, the emperor tensed, his expression darkening and his aura becoming heavier in a way she had not seen since the day he had come to her chambers after the theft of his sons. His eyes burned golden and his power pressed down on her as he fixed her with a glare and spoke, even as Isha's chair clattered away from her and she began to back away and preparing to conjure wraith bone armor. I am not a god. Isha stared at him, caught between fear, astonishment, and incredulity. Was that really what had set him off? Referring to him as a god? Of course he was a god construct, what else could he be? I intended no insult. Isha said carefully, keeping herself ready to sing armor and weapons into existence the moment she needed them. I was merely referring to the commonalities between us. The emperor's eyes narrowed, but he pulled his power in, the aura fading and his eyes reverting to a softer shade of gold. I am aware. He said curtly, crossing his arms. We are both warp constructs, but that does not make us gods. There is no such thing as gods. Any being that claims to be a god is nothing more than a parasite seeking to feed on the minds of mortals to enhance their power, little different from chaos. I will not lower myself to using such methods, nor will I allow humanity to become weak and reliant on false gods as your children were, instead of being able to stand on their own. Isha's temper mounted with each word he spoke, even as her fear kept it in check. She and her family were not parasites like the chaos gods and especially nothing like Slaanesh. They had always aided their people to the best of their abilities before the ban, and even afterwards, they had tried to help, to what limited extent that Asurian had allowed. Her children would not even have survived the war in heaven were it not for them. The only one of them who could truly be considered a parasite was Cain. To be compared to the foul, despicable creatures that were the chaos gods, to Slaanesh. Nor were her children weak because they had worshipped her and her family. Even if one agreed with the idea of religion being inherently a bad thing, which she did not, her children had endured for 14 million years without the direct guidance of her family, and it was only in the last few 100,000 years that they had truly lost their way. But from the look in the emperor's eyes and the unyielding conviction in her words, Isha knew he would not be willing to even consider, much less accept, of those arguments. So she swallowed her anger at being compared to Slaanesh and tried to think. What could she possibly say that would do more than waste her breath? Despite the tentative working relationship they had built over the past few years, Isha seriously doubted the emperor truly trusted her on a personal level. Their relationship was purely one of business. And if his words just now were anything to go by, he didn't respect her either. Her skills and knowledge perhaps, but not Isha herself. This was like dealing with Asurian all over again, Isha thought bitterly. The emperor and the Phoenix King were irritatingly alike. The arrogance, the presumption, the unwillingness to listen, and look where that had led Asurian. Yes, Asurian and the emperor were remarkably alike, with their cold, calculating strategies that failed to take into account anyone else's point of view. Wait. Calculating. Whatever else he might be, the emperor was calculating. He might not be able to conceal his emotions from her as well as he wished, but that didn't mean he lacked control over them. The guardian had to know how insulting his words were, and how much they would enrage her. He would not have said them without reason, not just for a minor slip on her part. This was another damned test, Isha realized, infuriated. He was provoking her to see how she would react. The emperor maintained his expression even as he saw the spark of realization in Isha's eyes. So she had realized he was deliberately trying to make her angry. He had expected her to take longer to be able to see through her anger, given how carefully aimed his words had been at everything she believed in, but it wasn't the first time that Isha had surprised him. He had not spoken untruly, but it had been deliberately phrased to make her as angry as possible, to push her limits. Why, Isha said, her eyes narrowed and jaw clenched. Are you deliberately provoking me? The emperor observed her, noting how her eyes were glowing faintly and sparks of green energy were crackling off her skin as he considered how to answer her question. To test your control, he said eventually. And to ensure that we both understand each other completely. There was no need for us to discuss this until recently, but I intend to allow you a greater degree of freedom soon. Isha's eyes widened in surprise at this, and the Emperor continued. But before I do that, testing your control and ensuring we have no misconceptions of each other was necessary. He had not come here intending to do this today, but Isha, foolishly referring to him as a god, had provided a convenient opportunity to both ensure she understood him and to test her control. Isha's nostrils flared. And are you satisfied? She asked through gritted teeth. The Emperor inclined his head. I am. You are ready for the next phase of my plans. Despite the deeply personal insult he had leveled at her, Isha had kept control, for the most part, and there were no longer any misunderstandings between them. And those plans would be. The Emperor paused, briefly considering whether he should withhold that a little longer, but seeing how furious Isha was at the moment, he decided that extending this small olive branch couldn't hurt. The restoration of Terra will go far more smoothly if you can more actively guide and coordinate with my biotechnical division. So, next week, you will accompany me to one of my more recently annexed territories. Though my armies were able to capture it, the ruling warlord devastated a large portion of it out of spite using nuclear weapons. You will begin testing your work there, alongside my best scientists, while I direct a campaign from there. Isha's aura faded at those words, her eyes dimming back to their normal verdant green, surprise seeming to displace her anger, though she remained tense. I see. The Emperor steepled his fingers, arching an eyebrow at Isha. I trust that you will comport yourself accordingly on this expedition. Isha's jaw clenched again, but she only said, I will. Then I will take my leave. The Emperor said, rising to his feet. He had accomplished what he wished, and now it would be best to leave Isha alone to calm down rather than strain her temper further. Isha nodded curtly at the Emperor's words, but otherwise said nothing as he departed, her mind and emotions in turmoil. Being compared to the Chaos Gods and that thing her children had created in particular, it hurt, even coming from someone like the Emperor, whom she barely knew. The Guardian's words had cut deep, deeper than he had intended, perhaps. After all, Isha doubted he knew enough of the pleasure cults to know that Slaanesh had been created to replace her. At their conception, the pleasure cults had been dedicated to her and she had welcomed their birth. She was a goddess of fertility, and originally, the pleasure cults truly had been nothing more than a way to spread happiness. Her children unknowingly, perhaps instinctively, evoking her primal form and rituals even she hardly remembered. But over time, things had changed. The pleasure cults grew more and more extreme. They began to employ slaves, dabble in dark sorcery and conduct horrifying experiments. The members of the pleasure cults who remembered their original intent and objected were silenced by any means necessary. And when Isha's priests, and those of the rest of her family had objected, Isha had to suppress her tears at the memory. When her pantheon's priests had finally declared the pleasure cults to be a cancer upon their civilization that had to be torn out, her children had decided to create a replacement for her instead of accepting that what they were doing was wrong. How it had hurt, how it still hurt, to know that so many of her children would rather have had something like Slaanesh than her. Oh, they had not intended to craft a chaos god that would devour their souls. The priests had proclaimed the coming of a golden goddess of pleasure who would aid them, who would enable their atrocities rather than try to stop them, a new mother and lover and queen all in one. And as the god forging had begun, Slaanesh's daemons had begun to manifest, eating away at her domain and power. Not as much as Nurgle, not at first, but slowly, they had grown until her domains were being overtaken by not one, but two chaos gods. Slaanesh, she was a twisted mockery of everything Isha had ever believed in and tried to uphold, and the fact that her children had crafted such a monster to replace her caused Isha more pain than anything the Emperor or even Nurgle could do to her. Isha took a deep breath, forcing those memories down for the moment. She was even less willing to show any vulnerability after the Emperor's infuriating little test than she had been an hour ago, given he had undoubtedly woven monitoring spells into the wards around her room. Isha refused to give him any more openings to exploit. She had to stay in control, to keep up her part of the bargain until she could return to her children. If the Emperor truly believed she was just going to be his docile pet biomancer, whom he could poke and prod at his whim, well, Isha would just have to take advantage of that, wouldn't she? 14. As Isha stepped out of the fortress for the first time, surrounded by custodians, the first thing that hit her was the air. It was incredibly toxic, though that didn't bother Isha, at least not physically. Her body easily filtered and purified the pollutants she was inhaling. Yet she couldn't help the pang of sorrow in her chest as she tasted the poison, and saw the dark gray skies clouded with dust and ash. This world was not beyond healing, but it was in dire need of it. There was a time Isha could have cleared the skies and air across the entire planet with a snap of her fingers. Now, even if the Emperor were to remove the bracers constraining her power and allow her to try, well, she thought she could perhaps still clear a large part of the local continent, but certainly not the entire planet. Looking around, Isha could see that they were on a vast platform extending out of the fortress's upper floors. There was a veritable fleet of airships of all shapes and sizes everywhere, as well various towers and stations clearly meant to be manned and maintained by people receiving and seeing off airships. And, Isha couldn't help but note wryly, most of the vessels and buildings were designed rather ostentatiously and painted bright gold. There were also grand symbols in bold crimson and black across the platform, on the various towers and ships, but also on proud flags, the most common being an eagle, likely the Emperor's personal sigil, or the symbol of the Imperium as a whole. Isha suspected the platform was normally a hub of activity, but at the moment, there was no one around except a few dozen custodians standing guard. And beyond that, the entire platform was cloaked in the Emperor's power, with vast, potent wards layered around the entire area. Clearly, it had been specially prepared for her arrival. How delightful! And there was the Emperor himself, striding out of the largest tower and towards them. Isha. The Lord of the Imperium greeted, stopping a few meters away from her. I hope you are prepared for our trip. I am, Your Majesty. Isha responded politely, though the way the Emperor's eyes narrowed ever so slightly made it clear he had noticed how she neither bowed nor inclined her head as she had on previous occasions. And he wasn't the only one. Isha could feel the subtle bristling of the custodians around her, deeply buried as those emotions were under their conditioning. The Emperor didn't comment, however. Then it is time for us to depart, he said instead. Of course. Isha nodded. Which ship is ours? The Emperor's lips twitched slightly as he clasped his hands behind his back. We are already on the ship. As he spoke, there was a thunderous roar as the engines of what Isha had initially thought was just a landing platform sprang to life. With the impossibly sharp eyes she had shaped for herself, Isha saw 4 massive turbines emerge from the sides of what she now realized was a massive airship and begin spinning. With a slight tremor, the ship detached itself from the side of the Emperor's fortress, gradually but steadily picking up speed as it began to move away. Come, we have much work to do, the Emperor said, striding back towards the tower he had emerged from, a slight but undeniable aura of smugness emanating from him. Isha followed, even as she had to stop herself from rolling her eyes at his theatrics. She doubted that he had been trying to impress her, exactly, but he was apparently just as incapable of not making a performance out of everything he did as Asurian had been. Entering the tower which she marked most likely to house the central command station, Isha was faintly surprised to see that it was not as garish as the outside. It was luxurious, yes, with wide, well-lit corridors and rich, red carpets that hushed every step, but the walls were painted a much more subdued shade of yellow and mostly bare of any ornamentation or paintings. The Emperor led her deeper into the vessel for several minutes, until they finally arrived at their apparent destination. Stepping inside the room, Isha immediately realized this would likely be her new dwelling, the design similar to the rooms she had inhabited previously, with the notable difference of a fairly large window, albeit one with wards over it. The Emperor turned to face her, his hands once more clasped behind his back. As I'm sure you've already guessed, these will be your new chambers, he said matter-of-factly. However, unlike at the Baihung Hive, you have my permission to freely move aboard this vessel for the most part, though there are some restricted areas under guard by the custodes, who will turn you away if you attempt to enter. I understand, Isha replied, wondering if this was the Emperor's attempt at a peace offering. May I ask when I am to begin work? In a few hours, the Emperor responded, confirming her suspicion this was probably an attempt at smoothing things over after their last conversation. Ordinarily, she'd have expected him to insist that they begin work immediately. I have other matters to attend to, but in the meantime, you may explore the vessel as you wish. Of course. The Emperor nodded briskly. Then I will see you soon. He left, not shutting the door behind him in a probably deliberate gesture. After a moment's thought, Isha decided to go back outside. She had spent long enough trapped inside a building, and even if this was almost certainly part of some scheme by the Emperor, she had no cause not to take advantage of it. Humming to herself, Isha walked through the corridors, idly noting the presence of several monitoring devices, as well as the custodians posted at various strategic positions, clearly meant to keep an eye on her. Perhaps she should have been angry, but even as irritated as she was with the Emperor right now, it seemed petty to resent him for such simple precautions. Emerging out onto the top of the ship once more, Isha looked up, appreciating the sight of a sky for the first time in years. Polluted and toxic as it was, it still felt good to have something to look at which wasn't the ceiling of the Emperor's fortress. And besides, she had seen far more revolting and terrifying sights than a dark gray sky. Wandering over to the edge of the ship, Isha peered down, seeing the vast city that surrounded the Emperor's fortress, feeling the thousands, millions, of sparks of life scurrying within it. At this height, a human or one of her children was unlikely to have been able to make out any fine details, but Isha could see that the city was heavily fortified, as well as a strange mishmash of various designs and architecture that added a certain vibrancy to the entire city. The two uniform structures across the city that she could see were the paved roads, and a network of artificial beacons, clearly meant to act as a replacement for the sunlight that could barely penetrate the clouds. Isha liked it. Even from this far above, the city felt vibrant and alive. She could sense the joy and passion of many people in it, all of them determined to make something of their lives even upon this broken world. It reminded her of the first cities her own children had built in the days after the crook had been broken. When secure fortifications were important, but no longer the sole priority, as her children had begun to live again and cast aside the exhaustion of the war in heaven. If this was the Emperor's attempt at a peace offering, it wasn't a bad one, Isha mused. She almost felt guilty for disobeying him and carrying out her plan just before they had departed. Almost. It wasn't as if it was actually going to hurt him or his plans after all. 15. Only Malkador and the commanders of the custodians are aware of your true nature. The Emperor told Isha as they strode through the hallways of the warship. Everyone else aware of your existence only knows that you are a powerful Eldar who specializes in biomancy, to whom I have granted protection in exchange for your knowledge and services. Do not tell anyone anything that could allow them to deduce who and what you truly are. I will not. Isha assured him. While she was less inclined to abide by the Emperor's rules now than she had been before, there was no point in circumventing his restrictions unless it served an actual purpose. The Emperor pinned her with his piercing gaze for a moment, and Isha wondered for a moment if he had noticed what she had done to her plants before leaving his fortress. Though there was little reason to believe that he wouldn't have confronted her by now if he knew. But the Emperor gave no indication that he had detected her designs, and instead merely nodded sharply after a moment. Good. They walked in silence after that, until they finally arrived at a door flanked by two custodes, whose inhumanely crisp stance sharpened even further in the presence of their liege, though they did nothing else as he and Isha entered the lab. The lab was not too different from the familiar one in the Emperor's fortress. It was clean, white, and sterile, with the same counters, shelves, chairs and tables, the last of which had a number of sample boxes on them. The beds for her patients were absent, but in their place was some sort of square, silver console, presumably some sort of computation device. The only difference, if it could be called that, was that there were no wards centered on the room, only the ones that covered the entire vessel. And there, standing next to the console was a woman, dressed in a white and blue coat over a blue shirt and trousers. Your Majesty. The woman said, bowing deeply to the Emperor as the two of them strode towards her. Director. The Emperor nodded to her as she straightened. Isha, this is the head of my biotechnical division, Amarastart. She examined much of your work. She has already learned much from the work you have provided to me previously, but I believe she will benefit from a more personal perspective on your skills. A pleasure. Isha nodded, regarding the human woman curiously. Her features were old, with steely gray hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and wrinkled skin, but Isha could sense the enhancements below the superficial appearance of an ordinary, aged mortal. The scientist looked old, but Isha estimated that Astarte was in truth healthier and stronger than most humans in their prime. Astarte nodded to her. "Lady Isha. It's good to finally meet you. Your work has been most impressive." "Thank you," Isha replied, inclining her head. "I am flattered that you think so. Flattery has nothing to do with it," Astarte said simply. "Your work is beyond anything else I have ever seen." Isha could sense the truth in her words, and a genuine interest and excitement at working with her, but there was also fear and resentment, carefully concealed and deeply buried. Partly a fear of Isha's alien nature and powers, but, mostly, a fear of being replaced. A baseless fear, in truth, but Isha had a suspicion that the Emperor allowed it to drive Astarte further, to accomplish more in efforts to prove her worth. It seemed like the sort of manipulative tactic that he would favor. But none of that truly mattered at the moment, so Isha simply said, "I appreciate that. So tell me, is there anything you have in mind for this project?" "As a matter of fact, I do." Astarte nodded, stepping forward to touch the console and activating a miniature holographic display of a ruined city, the entire projection glowing red. "As the Emperor has already told you, this city was destroyed by a nuclear bomb some decades ago, deployed by a warlord who did not wish to surrender the city to the Imperium. The city has been kept in lockdown ever since, though with your aid, we now hope to clear out the radiation and make it suitable for rebuilding and inhabitation once more." Astarte paused for a moment, apparently hesitating over something before speaking again. "Imperial expeditions into the city discovered something that I believe we can use and would fit with your talents, in particular, radiotrophic fungus. They have evolved to feed on radiation and use it as a source of sustenance." Astarte gestured to the boxes on the table. "We have a number of samples here, which I believe you can enhance to grow and absorb radiation more swiftly and efficiently than they already do, so that they can be used as tools to clear the city of radiation. The fungus in their natural state do not clear radiation, of course, but that should not be difficult for you to change." "Ah." Isha nodded. "A clever idea." And it truly was. Isha did not need the fungus to create a plant that could clear radiation, but it was an intelligent plan nevertheless, and if she were truly the mortal biomancer that Astarte believed her to be, the fungus would have been an excellent base to build on. Astarte smiled faintly. "Thank you. So, shall we begin?" "Yes, let's," Isha replied, before pausing for a moment as something occurred to her. "Your Majesty, will you be removing my bracelets, or would you prefer for me to work with them on?" "You will keep them on for now," the Emperor replied. "Given your previous work, there should be no need for their absence right now." "I understand." Isha nodded, moving over to the table. While it would have been nice to have the bracelets removed, she didn't truly need them gone to do something as simple as this, and given the spike of fear at her words and the relief at the Emperor's response Isha had sensed from Astarte, it was likely best to keep them on for now. Opening the boxes, Isha examined the array of small black fungi inside, analyzing their DNA. She couldn't help but smile slightly as she traced their evolution, realizing how quickly they must have adapted to the nuclear radiation saturating the place where they had grown. It was nice to see an example of nature's resilience and adaptiveness, something she'd have to live up to in the centuries to come. But that was a thought for another time. Raising her head, Isha spoke. "Beyond increasing the efficiency and lifespan of these fungi, is there any specific modification that you would like me to make?" "I would like to see you make the standard enhancements and analyze those first," Astarte said, her eyes filled with curiosity. "But I do have some ideas I would like you to test later." "Of course," Isha said, inclining her head, but before she could say anything else, the Emperor spoke. "It seems that you two have the work well in hand, then. I have some other matters to attend to, so I must depart, though I will return in a few hours." Isha regarded him, genuinely surprised he was willing to leave her alone with a mortal, before she realized with a spark of annoyance that this must be another one of his tests, though whether it was for her or Astarte, she could not say. Astarte, however, tensed, and her fear spiked once more, though she did not outwardly express it, merely bowing again. "Of course, Lord Emperor." The guardian of mankind nodded crisply, and departed before Isha could say anything else, leaving the goddess and mortal alone with each other. 16. 2 years ago. Your thoughts, Astarte? Astarte raised her head from the holographic display on her desk to look at Malkador, who was leaning back in the chair on the other side of the desk as he waited for her reply. My thoughts. She repeated. My thoughts are that what I'm looking at is impossible. She shook her head in disbelief, a look of unnerved fascination on her face. We've spent decades trying to refine the Thunder Warriors. The best and brightest minds of the Imperium. And despite all that, we have never been able to make them more than attack dogs that need to be kept on a leash. There hasn't even been significant progress on this. Not even from His Majesty. Astarte couldn't quite help the mixture of envy and awe that crept into her voice as she continued. And yet to look at this, the Emperor's mysterious new guest took one of their number and stabilized him in less than an hour, correcting flaws we have wrestled with for half a lifetime. And the day after that, she provided us with the cures and corrections we have been trying to devise for decades without success. Not all of them are currently viable, but most of them could be implemented tomorrow. Malkador nodded slowly. I suspected as much. Astarte's eyes narrowed, feeling a burst of annoyance. You knew all that, Malkador. I have no doubt that His Majesty conducted his own analysis before giving any of this to me. What was the point of this, exactly? Malkador sighed faintly, leaning back in his chair, seemingly trying to get more comfortable like the tired old man he pretended to be. Astarte wasn't fooled for one moment. The Sigillite was one of the most dangerous beings she had ever encountered, perhaps the most dangerous with the exception of the Emperor, and if there was anything on Terra that actually sapped his energy or made him uncomfortable, she had yet to learn of it. It's true that you aren't telling me anything new, Astarte. Malkador replied. But it is always good to get multiple perspectives. That was likely true, but Astarte doubted it was the whole truth. You wouldn't be sitting here if you just wanted confirmation of what you already know. She retorted. You'd just have waited for my report if that were the case. Malkador dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement. You are correct. Tell me, Astarte, what do you think of our guest's previous work? Astarte had to resist the urge to sigh at the way he danced around actually telling her what he wanted. It was all very impressive. She answered instead of pressing the point, knowing he'd either get to the point himself, or not at all. But this work with the Thunder Warriors is by far her most extraordinary work yet, even taking into account the mutants she healed. Those that Astarte had been allowed to examine, in any case. Some of them, the Emperor had refused to let her see or even know the identity of. Astarte couldn't help but be worried about that. Though the Emperor had kept the new geneticist locked away and isolated for the last year, she couldn't quite quell the fear that sooner or later, she would be replaced. Oh, Astarte doubted the Emperor would kill or even imprison her. He had never been in the habit of disposing of useful assets, but if he decided he liked his new guest better, he might very well demote Astarte and grant control of the biotechnical division to his prisoner. Malkador nodded. Yes. Her work so far has been beyond anything that humans, at least in this day and age, are capable of. Astarte stiffened slightly at his words, especially the emphasis on a certain word. He couldn't be implying what she thought he was, surely. Malkador leaned forward. Tell me, Astarte, what do you know of the Eldar? Now. Astarte straightened from her bow as the Emperor left, regarding the Eldar woman warily, her mind drifting back to that conversation with Malkador. She had heard myths and stories of the Eldar before that. Fey aliens from the darkest edges of the galaxy. Enigmatic and terrible, their motivations impossible to comprehend for humans despite their eerie resemblance to mankind. When they descended on a world, it was impossible to say whether they had come to help or to destroy, only that everything they did was to amuse themselves. All of those were hearsay and legends, however. It was only during that conversation that Astarte had learned of any concrete information on the Eldar, from Malkador, and later, from the Emperor himself. According to them, there was indeed a grain of truth to all those stories. The Eldar were an impossibly old race, who had dominated the galaxy since before mankind had even learned to walk upright. Malkador had rather tersely and reluctantly admitted that Eldar technology and warp craft had surpassed even that of the greatest feats accomplished by the ancients during the Golden Age. The Eldar Empire had collapsed recently, destroyed by a cataclysm of its own making, though His Majesty and the Sigillite had both refused to elaborate on what exactly they had done, and Lady Isha was a refugee of the disaster. She had sought protection from the Emperor, offering her knowledge and skills in exchange for being shielded from her enemies, and the Emperor had agreed. Isha fit the physical description of those myths, at least. Her features were inhumanly perfect, even more so than that of various transhumans that Astarte had encountered and those she had created herself. Not even the custodes, each of them shaped into the pinnacle of humanity by the master of mankind himself, were so beautiful. The only person with such unervingly flawless features that Astarte knew was the Emperor himself. And there was the way she moved, with grace and fluidity that was utterly alien in how perfect it was, and yet, once more familiar in how it echoed the Emperor's own inhuman movements. But though Isha fit the physical aspect of the myths on the Eldar, her personality was completely different. All her work, whether it was crops, medicines, or even the alterations made to the Thunder Warriors, indicated the sort of compassion and softness that Astarte expected from the most naive and idealistic young scientists the Emperor sent to the biotechnical division, not an alien psyker from a species that even the ancients of the Golden Age had regarded warily. But despite that, alone in a room with Isha as the alien's piercing gaze settled on her, Astarte could not help the fear she felt. Part of her wanted to say the Emperor would surely not leave her alone with an alien who would harm her, but the rest of her reminded her that said alien possessed the power and knowledge to render Astarte entirely redundant. Not to mention Malkador's warnings of how deceptive and manipulative the Eldar could be. But most of all, Astarte could not help but be afraid of Isha's psychic abilities. At least as strong as Malkador, the Emperor had said. It was a terrifying thought. Astarte knew what psykers were capable of, had seen them burn cities to ash and tear armies asunder. And she knew that most of those psykers were nothing compared to the Sigillite, whose power was surpassed by the Emperor alone. Being alone with an alien that strong wasn't exactly something Astarte was comfortable with. Yet, it was hardly as if she had a choice. Steeling herself, Astarte spoke. Lady Isha, could you begin with expanding the size of the fungi, first? Starting with simple requests would hopefully make Isha more amenable and cooperative, and if not, at least allow Astarte to feel her out. Of course. The alien replied. Even her voice was unnaturally perfect, smooth, and melodious in such a way that every word sounded like a beautiful song, yet another similarity to the Emperor. Granted, the Lord of the Imperium's voice rarely sounded musical, as such, but it was still flawless in a way beyond even the most potent transhumans couldn't match. Or, at least, no transhumans in this day and age. Astarte had her own suspicions about the origin of the Emperor's powers. But now was not the time to dwell on such things, so instead Astarte forced herself to focus as Isha plucked one of the fungi from the open box, which promptly began to swell in her palm. Within moments, it was the size of Astarte's head, after which Isha placed it on the table. Astarte nodded, slightly relieved that the alien seemed to have no issue with her requests. Thank you. Could you please clone several samples of it, now? The Eldar raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, simply waving her hand. A dozen small pieces of the swollen, well, no, not exactly swollen, that implied the increase in size wasn't perfectly smooth and natural, fungi broke off, floating over the table even as the fungi regenerated. The pieces settled on the table, arranged in a row on both sides of their source, before rapidly growing into fungi identical to the original. Astarte had to do her best to stop herself from swallowing slightly at the display of power. It was a parlor trick compared to what she had seen psykers far less powerful than Malkador do before, but it was still unnerving. But she refused to show any weakness in front of the alien. Reaching into her pocket, Astarte pulled out her scanner, a cylindrical device capable of conducting detailed genetic scans despite its small size. She ran it over the fungi, then activated the holographic display, examining the data even as she remained uncomfortably aware of Isha's inhumanly bright eyes on her. The data was deeply fascinating, from a purely academic standpoint, but the only new thing that it told Astarte was that Isha's knowledge and skill in biomancy was even greater than she had feared. Astarte had examined the works of other, human, biomancers before, and one thing that had always been clear to her was that a biomancer's precision and effectiveness were exactly proportionate to their grasp of things like biology and genetics. Products of biomancy which weren't crude and, ultimately, a result of brute forcing overcoming myriad flaws were things Astarte had rarely examined. Until Isha. Isha's work was leagues beyond anything a human biomancer could produce. It was beyond what Astarte herself could do even with those few, precious relics of the Golden Age that the Emperor had given to her for her work. And a part of Astarte suspected that at least in this particular area, Isha dwarfed even the Emperor himself. But Astarte had previously believed that Isha at least had to invest time and effort into creating such superb work. Or rather, she had hoped that was the case, even when the evidence mounted against it. Now, as she scanned the fungi in front of her, finding no trace of inefficiency or degradation, it was clear that what Isha had done so casually was as flawless and brilliant as any of her other work, with the genetic code and physical structure of the fungi being as perfectly balanced as it had ever been. Better, even. While she was not privy to all that Isha had done for the Emperor, Astarte had a sinking feeling that no task Isha had been given so far had even been remotely a challenge. Looking up from the data to see the alien still patiently waiting for an answer, Astarte pasted a smile on her face and spoke. "This is impressive work, Lady Isha. These will help enormously with clearing the city of radiation." "Thank you," Isha replied, and she sounded as if she meant it. "What else did you have in mind?" "Apart from the fungi, I have another plant that are naturally good at clearing radiation, called helianthus, more commonly known as sunflowers," Astarte explained, pointing to one of the other boxes. "I was hoping to experiment on those and the rest of the fungi as well." Even as she spoke, Astarte willed for the Emperor to return as quickly as possible. This session couldn't be over soon enough. 17. Isha watched Astarte go, feeling a pang of disappointment. The mortal had stank of fear throughout their session, and Isha had been unable to allay it. Given the fear and wariness emanating from the mortal, Isha had determined this session would be more productive if she allowed Astarte to control the flow of the conversation. Though their work had indeed benefited, the mortal's anxiety had not wavered in the slightest. She had just kept a firm grasp on it, and when the Emperor had finally arrived and dismissed her, it was clear that Astarte had been all too eager to obey. If they were to work together in the future, Isha was going to have to find a way to truly lay her fears to rest, or at least reduce them. But that was a topic for another time. Putting away thoughts of Astarte for the moment, Isha focused on the Emperor, who was standing at the table, examining the fungi and prodding them psychically. Quelling the instinct to tell the Emperor to stop lest he hurt the fungi, Isha spoke. "So, what next, Your Majesty?" she asked carefully. The Emperor's golden gaze shifted to her, a spark of anticipation igniting in his eyes. "We are almost at our destination," he replied. "Once we are there, we will go down, and you will do your best to terraform a region of the city with your suppressors on, as a demonstration for Astarte and her subordinates." Isha stared at him in astonishment, genuinely taken aback by his words. She had not expected to be allowed to wield her powers for such a purpose for several more years, perhaps even decades. The fact that the Emperor wanted such a demonstration was more than a little surprising. "I see," Isha said finally, unsure of what else to say. She strongly suspected there was more to this than he was telling her, likely some sort of way to gauge the reactions of other mortals to her, but the prospect of truly stretching her powers for the first time since the fall, of restoring life and beauty to even a relatively minuscule portion of this world was tempting. Dealing with another test was a small price to pay. The Emperor clearly noticed her curiosity, however, and his lips twitched into a slight smirk. "Do not mistake my intention. I will place wards around the area first to ensure secrecy, and your audience will be relatively small, less than a dozen scientists. But I wish to see you use your powers on a larger scale, and since you will be working with these scientists moving forward, it is best for them to have at least some grasp of how powerful you truly are." "Ah, so it is about gauging the reactions of the mortals." Even aside from that, the Emperor's reasoning was sound. While she couldn't say she wasn't wary of what else he might have planned, even knowing this much of what he intended was useful and less irritating than being yanked around like one of Segurika's puppets. So Isha nodded. "I understand, Your Majesty." The Emperor returned the nod, turning away to leave. "I will be in the command center. You may remain here or go out on the deck until we arrive." Isha had to resist the urge to roll her eyes as he disappeared out of the doorway. As if she was going to stay closeted within this room when she had the option of being outdoors. Shaking her head, Isha strode out, eager to be outside once more. A mixture of anticipation and anxiety bubbled in Isha's chest as she emerged into the air and looked around, noting that the ship was steadily drifting downwards, and below them, Isha could see their destination. The desolate ruins of what had once been a great city, the one she was being brought to heal. Once majestic towers that had been reduced to crumbling shells, the scorched and broken remnants of the city's fortifications, it made for a sorry sight. But more than anything, Isha was repulsed by the poison that shrouded the city's corpse like an invisible haze, a lingering remnant of the monstrous weapon that had been used on it. Isha had always disliked radioactive weaponry. They had occasionally been employed by the Ingur during the War in Heaven, and more frequently by the Canib during the Wars of Reclamation. Those foul creatures corrupted everything they touched, from the stem to the root, and so toxic radiation had appealed to them. But more than anything, the lingering effects of radioactive weaponry reminded her of her own children's atrocities, against their own kin and mortal races alike. Reducing entire worlds to nightmarish hellscapes with sorcery, poisoning the very air until it would warp and twist all those who breathed it in and survived, and a slow, agonizing death for those who did not, it had at once broken Isha's heart and made her blood boil every time her children did such things in the name of entertainment, for all that it was hardly the worst of the crimes they had committed. Grimacing, Isha pushed away the thoughts of her children. She was out of her gilded cage and would be allowed to heal some portion of this world at last. It was a good day, not the time to linger on things she could currently do nothing about. Instead, Isha focused her senses on the city, carefully analyzing it in preparation for her arrival, assessing the amount of radiation in the air, the more common pollutants prevalent everywhere on Terra, calculating the ideal amount of oxygen to add to the air and how many nutrients to inject into the infertile soil. Lost in the string of calculations and planning, Isha was shaken from her thoughts several moments later by a polite cough, and she spun to look at the Emperor, who was standing there with a faintly amused look on his face. Some ways behind were a group of mortals, who Isha presumed to be the Emperor's scientists, going by Astarte's presence among them. They were a small group, less than 10, all dressed in protective gear in preparation for their descent into the poisoned city. They were all quietly discussing something, occasionally casting furtive glances at her. Isha could easily have listened in on their conversation from where she stood, but she had temporarily reduced her hearing capacity as a courtesy. There was no need to be rude, after all. And, Isha realized, they had arrived. The ship had finally stopped, hovering only a short distance from the ruins. Isha. The Emperor greeted. Ladies and gentlemen. He directed towards his scientists, beckoning to one of the smaller ships nearby. Come, we have work to do. Sighing, Isha leaned against a wall and crossed her arms as she waited for the Emperor to finish his work. The city was as barren and desolate as she had expected, the only sign of life being a few of the fungi that Astarte had shown her earlier. She itched to begin her work, her every instinct screaming at her to begin purifying and revitalizing the soil here immediately, but she had to wait until the Guardian of Mankind was done, no matter how much it grated on her nerves. As she waited impatiently, the Emperor wove a series of wards around the area he had selected for this demonstration, his eyes glowing and the air shimmering gold with the power that was being added to it. The mortals were watching their liege with a mixture of awe and apprehension, having forgotten Isha for the moment. The custodians assigned to protect them seemed as unfazed as Isha, however, even if they didn't share her impatience, instead standing as still and silent as statues, content to wait until their lord required something of them. It took several more minutes, but at last, the Emperor seemed satisfied with his work, the golden haze of power fading away as though it had never been there, though Isha knew it would flare to life once more if she tried to breach the wards. The Emperor nodded to her. You may begin. Finally. Isha stepped forward and breathed in deeply, tasting the pollutants and the radiation in the air. Toes curling in the soil, she could feel the poison in the soil below her, a burning corruption, killing or twisting all the living things here. Well, that was what she was here to fix. Dimly noting that the Emperor had established a psychic shield around the mortals, who had their attention fixed upon her once more, Isha sat down on the ground. Heedless of how the dirt might stain her clothes, Isha crossed her legs and closed her eyes in concentration. A soft green aura emanated from her, pulsing gently with power as the primordial energies of light and life flowed out from the Everqueen, cleansing everything within reach and nurturing it to bring forth life once more. Isha did not force her will on the world, but joined with it, giving the things in it the strength to live and flourish once more. Isha reached deep into scorched and irradiated soil, her power burning away every last trace of radiation, locating any useful and toxic elements alike, and then twisting and transforming them into beneficial nutrients, seeds, roots, and plants. Isha had not done this sort of direct transmutation on anything the Emperor had given to her so far, but he had requested a demonstration. And so, life bloomed where it should have been impossible for anything to grow. The sweet, fresh smell of nature filled the air as vibrant green blades of grass surged to life around their feet, followed by blooming flowers of all kinds, roses of every color, soft white daisies and most of all, cheerful-looking sunflowers, each and every one of them swelling with Isha's love. Great trees erupted from the ground at Isha's encouragement, spiraling upwards and breaking through crumbling stone and rusted steel like a hammer would shatter glass, until there was not a single building left standing. Verdant leaves and ripe fruits hung from the branches of each tree, shining red apples, vivid golden mangoes, bright peaches, and many more. There was more to the forest than was visible on the surface, however. Each and every plant in the area was designed to safely absorb radiation and convert it into useful forms, which would ensure that they all continued to flourish instead of being poisoned no matter what. They were far more robust and healthy than any normal plant could ever be, with enhanced lifespans that meant they could survive for centuries. Isha paused for a moment, wondering whether to augment their ability to propagate as well, but decided against it. The Emperor was unlikely to be pleased by such a thing. There was only one task remaining. Isha reached deep into the earth, searching for something, and there it was. It wasn't strictly necessary, but it would be a good final touch, the goddess mused as she pulled it through the layer of rock and soil as gently as she could. Until, at last, the earth shook and trembled as a great crack opened throughout the city, a crack which became a great river as the water that Isha had drawn to the surface came rushing up with a thunderous roar. Isha opened her eyes, casting a look at the Emperor and his followers. The mortals were radiating astonishment behind the Emperor's shield, staring at the verdant forest around them in a mixture of awe and shock, and as for the Emperor, there was something dangerously like hope in those golden eyes. Astarte didn't know what to think. As the sweet scent of flowers spread through the air, the shattered ruins in front of her transformed into a thriving forest, and a great river burst from the ground with a roar, somehow not causing an earthquake. Astarte struggled to make sense of it all. Part of her wanted to rush forward, to examine every single thing in this forest, to unravel its every mystery and discover everything it had to offer, and devise a way to recreate it all. The rest of her was even more wary of Isha now, and desperately longed to be as far from her as possible. Astarte cast a glance at the Emperor, who seemed to be drinking in the view of the entire forest. Most of the Imperium's leadership knew of the Emperor's desire to heal Terra, to see it remade from a wasteland of dust and ash into the shining blue gem that the myths of the Golden Age claimed it had once been. She had never really believed it was possible, even for him, but that belief had wavered ever since she had first seen Isha's work, and now. She couldn't help but wonder if the Emperor was being entirely objective about this. His dream of reviving Terra was one of the two projects she had ever heard him speak of with true passion and hope. The other one had been the creation of the Primarches. Was the Emperor really considering all this rationally, or was he blinded by the hope that Isha offered? Astarte wanted to say the master of mankind would never fall prey to such things, but she was far too old and weary to give such faith to anyone, even the Emperor. The Emperor breathed deeply, taking in unfiltered fresh air for the first time since he had returned to Terra amidst the horror of the Age of Strife. Even as he tried to clamp down on his emotions, he couldn't help the smile that pulled at the corners of his mouth when he drank in the sight of the first new forest to grow on Terra since the Golden Age had ended in a storm of iron, blood, and warp fire. The fresh air, the verdant leaves, the blooming flowers, the sound and sight of a flowing river, for the first time in centuries, it felt like a small piece of the Terra he had once known, the paradise he had bestrode as a young man, had been restored. Some echo of that young man who had been eager to explore every corner of the beautiful world that he had been made to protect, who had delighted in every new thing he came across, remained in his heart, and he couldn't truly quell it. The only thing missing was sunlight, clouded as the skies still were. He cast a look at Astarte, sensing her doubt about whether he was being entirely objective about this. He understood why she thought so, but this was only the beginning. Countless tests would have to be run on everything in this forest, from the greatest trees to the smallest blade of grass. And if the results were not satisfactory, he would have to scour this entire forest to the ground with warp fire. It would pain him, but he had destroyed things that of far greater value, both to himself and others, than one forest. If it had to be done, he would not flinch from doing it. No matter how nostalgic he felt right now, the Emperor knew this was not truly a piece of the Terra of his youth. He could feel Isha's power radiating from the entire forest. Great caution would have to be taken here. But if all the tests came back clean, if this was truly the first step on the path to Terra's rebirth, then the Emperor would not allow anything to hamper it. Perhaps it might be a mistake, in the end, extending even this sliver of trust to Isha. Perhaps Isha had already betrayed him, driven by her resentment of his tests, and he would discover some hidden trap in this forest upon further analysis. And if that were so, he would not hesitate to strike her down. But for now, Revelation smiled and allowed himself to hope of a Terra reborn, a verdant paradise with cities of shining gold, once more the pinnacle of civilization and the beating heart of mankind's empire. 18. Ezekiel Sedain, Assistant Director of the Imperial Biotechnical Division, shifted in his seat, trying to conceal his trepidation. He was not a fearful man, no one who worked for the Emperor was, but it was difficult not to feel a little nervous when you were waiting alone in the office of Malkador the Sigillite. All the more so when waiting for him to arrive so that you could report the results of the task he had assigned you. To the populace of the Imperium, Malkador seemed the more human of the Imperium's leaders. Not necessarily kinder or gentler, but more down to earth and in touch with humans, a contrast to the Emperor's aloof majesty and power. They were not strictly wrong, but it was not a complete image of the Sigillite either. Ezekiel only knew a few fragments of Malkador's true nature and past, but even those scraps of knowledge made him feel uneasy when dealing with the man. Perhaps Ezekiel would have been more at ease if he thought that Malkador would like what he had to say, but he very much doubted the Sigillite would be pleased with the results of his work. Not that Ezekiel himself was happy about what he had to present. He had always hated the taste of failure, and even more so when he had failed a task given to him by the Emperor himself. The Emperor had imparted upon him great knowledge and the secrets of the Golden Age, accepted him as a student and made him part of the greatest empire that Terra, no, the galaxy would ever know. Ezekiel knew he was unlikely to be punished for this, but all the same, it still burned. Ezekiel shook his head, trying to clear his mind. Getting worked up over this would accomplish nothing. In an effort to distract himself, Ezekiel looked around Malkador's office. The room was reasonably large, though nowhere near as vast as the Emperor's. It was largely Spartan, with a medium-sized steel desk and wooden chairs, where Ezekiel was seated. The floor and the walls were painted a dark blue, bare of any decoration except for two paintings. One of a dark-haired woman with an enigmatic smile, and another of sunflowers in a flower pot. They did not look like anything special to Ezekiel, but he knew that they were ancient beyond measure, having been created even before the Golden Age, before mankind had ever risen to the stars, and that they had been preserved ever since. Ezekiel frowned as he examined the paintings, unable to understand what was so valuable about them. Why would anyone preserve simple paintings for so long? And why did Malkador value them so highly? Not only them, for Ezekiel knew that the Sigillite had a collection of similar relics, and it baffled him as to what value the Malkador could see in such utterly useless things. Interested in my paintings, Dr. Sedain? Ezekiel jolted, springing to his feet and turning around to see Malkador standing behind him, somehow having arrived completely silently, eyeing Ezekiel with a slight smile and a twinkle in his eyes. Ezekiel suppressed a scowl, bowing slightly. Lord Sigillite. I was just curious. Perhaps I'll educate you on them later. Malkador said serenely, circling the desk to sit behind it. But for now, what have you discovered? Ezekiel grimaced but steeled himself. I'm afraid that I have nothing, my lord. Nothing? Malkador asked, his eyes narrowing and fingers tightening around his staff. Truly? Yes. Ezekiel said, bowing his head. I have run every test that I know of on the plants you gave me, and I could find nothing beyond the expected. They are augmented, of course, with increased durability and longevity, enhanced regeneration, and a reduced need for nutrients. But nothing out of the ordinary for the work of the Emperor's guest. Ezekiel couldn't help the bitter mixture of shame and envy that swelled within him at having to admit his failure. The work of the Emperor's mysterious guest had astounded and befuddled them all at every turn, and for all that Ezekiel knew he should be glad for how said work had benefited the Imperium, he couldn't help but feel jealous. Malkador was silent for a long moment, apparently contemplating something, before finally speaking. "Very well. You may go." That was it? Ezekiel blinked. He had expected a far harsher reprimand for his failure, but he decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Bowing once more, Ezekiel stepped away. The last thing he saw before leaving the room was the brooding look on the usually serene Sigilite's face. Malkador sighed wearily, leaning back in his chair and letting his staff lean against the desk. Sedane's report had been disappointing. He had not been able to find anything of interest in Isha's plants. Well, nothing of interest to Malkador. Like the rest of the biotechnical division, no doubt Sedane had discovered even more things that would alternatively leave him in awe and drive him mad with curiosity. None of the tests that Malkador had run on the plants himself had given him what he sought. No device at his disposal, nor any of the numerous pieces of warpcraft he knew had shown these plants to be anything other than what they should have been. The imprint of Isha's power was all over them and the modifications were easy enough to see, but he had found nothing dangerous or even unknown. Malkador should have been pleased, but his instincts screamed at him that there was no way there wasn't some hidden trap in those plants, or at least some sort of contingency in case Isha ever felt unsafe. The Sigilite rubbed a hand across his face. This was getting him nowhere. His best efforts had found nothing in the plants, and he doubted that he was going to find anything. Leaning forward, Malkador pulled out a tablet from one of the desk drawers, and inputted a few commands, sending instructions to the custodians to escort Isha's plants back to her chambers. The wards there were stronger and more secure than the labs, and it would be better for the plants to remain there until he could think of some other test on. He had other work to do that he could not afford to delay any longer. He would just have to come back at this from a fresh angle later. The Sigilite just hoped that nothing disastrous occurred in the meantime. The custodians had received Malkador's command, and secured Isha's plants within specially warded containers to return them to the aliens' rooms. Vigilant for any attack she might launch, they double and triple-checked the measures before moving out. Unknown to the custodians, within the containers, each of the plants that contained Isha's power bloomed beyond the traces of her touch that Malkador had seen. Scraps of energy pulling together into blossoms made as much of light as anything physical. Strange flowers begot stranger fruits, sparks of psychic energy, each one containing a message of hope, love, and a promise that she would return someday, meant for Isha's lost children. Isha had released some whispers into the immaterium before, as quietly as she could, but those were far and few in between, and she could not be sure any of them reached her children. The plants contained more, far more. The messages, akin to psychic whispers that were imperceptible unless one was looking for them, slipped straight into the immaterium. To slip unnoticed through the wards was an incredible challenge, one that Isha had resolved herself to risk the consequences of if her estimation of Malkador failed. But the Sigilite had done as she predicted, removing her plants from her chambers, and though the wards on the containers were secure, they were not as secure on the ones around either Isha's chambers or the lab. Even so, it had not been easy to design enchantments that would allow her messages to pass through without notice. But Isha's efforts had succeeded, and so it was that her whispers slid past the wards on the containers entirely, vanishing into the ether. Her messages, appearing as sparks of light in the immaterium to any who might have noticed them, drifted through the great ocean, to any and all Yildari who might hear them. And here they did. The world-zingers of the Exodusites and the seers of the craft worlds were torn between desperate hope and abject fear, unable to ascertain if the message was true or false. In the eye of terror, the hand of Asurian and his students heard the message. Despite their astonishment, they did not doubt it as their kin had, for they had encountered the power of the old gods before. But even they were unsure of what to do. Few of Isha's whispers made their way into the webway, and most of them were bitterly dismissed and forgotten. Those broken realms were not a place where hope could endure. Save one exception. Deep in the webway, The great trickster heard his lost sister's message, and laughed. The great game was going to have another player, it seemed. Check the description for the links to the author.